Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this first session in this series, Foresight Hydrogen, Accelerating the Hydrogen Economy. My name is Peter Gray. I'll be the chair for the session this afternoon. I have quite a long background in green energy, hydrogen fuel cells, etc. I work for, I'm a partner in the consultancy Acumen. So more information you can see on our website if you're interested. So our first speaker this afternoon, we're very happy to welcome Bart, if I can pronounce the name correct, Bart Biebeek. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bart.
Biebeek.
From the, who probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Bart is quite well known from Fuel Cells and Hydrogen Joint Undertaking from Brussels. So without further ado, we shall start. And Bart, can you just give a very brief introduction to yourself? And then we'll go straight into the webinar.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to the organizers for having me. Yes, so I'm Bart Biebeek. I was, before I joined the Fuel Cells and Hydrogen Joint Undertaking in 2016, actually, I worked for Toyota and R&D. Actually, I was helping also Toyota to develop their first hydrogen vehicle. I think many of you know the Mirai very well. So I've worked on the Mirai, but also helped to build out, for example, in Belgium, the first hydrogen refueling station. So I've been in the area of hydrogen and fuel cells already for quite a while. And so now I'm heading actually the Fuel Cells and Hydrogen Joint Undertaking towards its new mission from next year. But you will hear all about that in my presentation. So, shall I start? So, the Fuel Cells and Hydrogen Joint Undertaking is basically a public-private partnership. We have a very focused objective, is of course to make sure that these products are market ready by 2020. And actually, together with our private partners, and our private partners are actually Hygiene Europe here, which is the industry grouping, around 150 plus members, 40% are SMEs. And on the other hand, we have the Hygiene Europe research grouping, which is around 80 members. And these are our private members. And then in the middle, we have the European Commission as a public member, represented by the Directorates of Transport, Energy, and of course, Research. And together, so we are the FCSJU, and we have supported 263 projects now in Europe. We have supported that for taxpayers' money, around 985 million euro. Important to mention that also the private side have put in a little bit even more money privately, but it's almost like one-to-one. We have made last year a hydrogen roadmap for Europe. That was for the first time. We did that together with a lot of companies. And one of the results was by 2050 that hydrogen could account for 24% of the final energy demand in Europe, but also could annually abate around 560 million tons, have 820 billion euros of annual revenues, reduce, of course, also other emissions. But very important also for Europe is to create 5.4 million jobs. And that led actually into the European Hydrogen Strategy, which was announced on the 8th of July this year, during the summer. And actually, this was quite amazing for us that the European Union basically made a strategy only on one sector. And for us, that was really, like I always say, it was a bit of the cherry on the cake, because after 12 years of hard working and research and innovation, finally, the Commission also recognized the potential of this technology. And they actually made 3 phases. They set the first phase, or first objective, by 2024 to put 6 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers and create 1 million tons of renewable hydrogen. The main purpose is to replace existing hydrogen production. As you know, today already 94% of the, or even 96% of the current hydrogen is actually gray hydrogen. We will start to make a regulation for liquid hydrogen markets and also make a good planning for the infrastructure. In phase 2, from 2025 to 2030, the aim is to put 40 gigawatts of renewable electrolyzers, renewable hydrogen electrolyzers in the field, create 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen. We will tap into new applications in steel, transport. We also will use the hydrogen for the electricity balancing purposes and create hydrogen valleys. As you know, today we have already one hydrogen valley in the northern part of the Netherlands, and we want to create more of those valleys across Europe, and at the end, connect them. And that's why we will need cross-border logical infrastructure. And then in phase 3, basically, we believe that this technology should be matured and really can be deployed at a large scale to really use it in hard to abate sectors for CO2. So we will also have to expand the hydrogen-derived synthetic fuels. We will have really established this EU-wide infrastructure network, and of course it has to be an open international market. And all of these 3 phases actually have to be supported by the Clean Hydrogen Alliance. They have to come up with an EU investment agenda in order to achieve this strategy of the European Union. This strategy has a full value chain approach. It's divided in 5 areas. It has an investment agenda. It will boost demand, the infrastructure development, R&I activity, and the international dimension. When we go now first to an investment agenda, and the European Union has already many different kind of investment facilities. I mean, we have the next generation EU budget, Invest EU budget. We have cohesion policies, Connecting Europe facilities for energy, but also for transport, innovation fund, Horizon Europe. So many possibilities exist depending on the type of project you want to do. But important to say that a lot of money, investment will happen, for example, in renewable electricity production. Up to 340 billion euro will have to be invested in that area. For the renewable hydrogen, we expect up to 43 billion euro. In hydrogen transport and distribution, for example, pipelines or whatever, 65 billion euro. The heavy duty and transport, 13 billion euro, and in steel, 8 billion euro. And all of this will be supported by the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance. The next thing is, of course, you only can get investors investing in this technology when there is also a demand. So we will need to foster this demand. And we will, of course, our aim is to work on renewable. However, we also understand that in the transitional period, we might still need to also use low carbon hydrogen, or the blue hydrogen that they call it sometimes. The main purpose that we will be to replace existing hydrogen production, because that by replacing existing hydrogen production, we will be able to foster the demand faster. We will also use it in fertilizers or in steel, for the buses, fleets, heavy duty, and so on, and maritime and aviation. We will support end consumers. And how do we do that? We have, for example, the European strategy on clean steel, which exists, but also the sustainable and smart mobility strategy, where we put some kind of requirements in for public authorities to purchase zero-emission cars, for example. So this is one way to foster the demand, but also create markets. So we need to make sure that we have a certification for renewable and low carbon hydrogen. We have, we will try to use sector quotas. We will make sure that the infrastructure can reach all the consumers, of course, and it has to be an open and competitive hydrogen market, of course. Supply and infrastructure. We will support producers through different kind of support mechanisms, and develop the EU-wide hydrogen infrastructure. How we will do that? The producers we will mainly support by a common low carbon threshold for hydrogen production facilities, so that they know that if they produce hydrogen, this is the maximum amount. The certification I mentioned already. The emission trading scheme will be revised. Carbon contract for differences is definitely something next year. Plan for the hydrogen infrastructure. Next, that was going too fast. Research and innovation. Of course, maintain and even strengthen our role, leadership role that we have at the moment here in Europe. And this will happen through an establishment of the Clean Hydrogen Partnership. So the FCHJU will cease to exist from next year, middle of next year, and it will be turned into a Clean Hydrogen Partnership joint undertaking. We also will do research and innovation in other parts of Horizon Europe, which is a successor of Horizon 2020. We will have the Innovation Fund, but also Interregional Innovation Investments Instrument will help as well. In the R&I activity, we will work on 4 main things. Is on the hydrogen generation, mainly large size, but we will have to look into efficiency, so better efficiency, cost reduction, but also we will have to look into mass manufacturing. So, and also to see low TRL technologies like ALK or direct sunlight splitting and all these kind of things. So this we will do. The second pillar will be on the large-scale end-use applications, industry, steel, chemical, but also transport, heavy-duty, pre-normative research. Infrastructure, that will be new for us. It's about the distribution and the storage of hydrogen and big volumes, and also transported over long distances. And finally, we have to do also the cross-cutting, which is more the horizontal thing, is like standardizations, critical raw materials, recycling, and all this stuff. Hydrogen has also an international dimension. We have to, again, work together with our partners around the world. This will happen through bilateral and regional cooperation. We have a neighborhood investment platform. We will have also different association agreements sign up. We have also the Africa-Europe Green Initiative. And whenever there's any meeting on international level, they will make sure that hydrogen is always put on the table. On the international markets, I mean, we have to make sure that we have a common greenhouse gas emission reduction standard. So my green hydrogen is also equal green hydrogen in Australia, for example. We want to have the euro as a benchmark for transactions in hydrogen and facilitate basically an emergence of rule-based hydrogen market. We need to trade according to rules. But also we will talk or engage in many multilateral fora. The IPHE is the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy. We work in emission innovation. We have every year a hydrogen energy ministerial meeting. This is in Japan. And also under the CEM, the Clean Energy Ministerial, we have a hydrogen initiative where always Europe is there as well. I move now to the Clean Hydrogen Alliance. What is it? Well, it was launched at the same time on the 8th of July. But the mission here is really to create really a pipeline for a massive rollout of these technologies. And we want to involve all the stakeholders in this ecosystem. So this is one is on transmission distribution, one on mobility, one on industrial application, one on energy, and one on residential application. Each of this roundtable will be chaired by a CEO, really a club of CEOs, I will say, but they all work on that same team and they will report regularly on their progress and really on their investment, because this is their mission. They need to build a pipeline of investment and establish really this investment agenda. It's all about scaling up this hydrogen value chain and actually helping to implement this European hydrogen strategy. The blueprint for all these investments, we estimate around 430 billion euro by 2030 will need to be invested. Well, who can join? Basically, industry, national, local public authorities, civil society, other stakeholders. Basically, everybody involved in the whole hydrogen value chain, renewables, low carbon hydrogen, mobility, industry, everybody basically. It's also open to public-private actors, but all these actors that want to join need to agree on the objectives that has been set out in the declaration of the Alliance. So, and by the way, the Alliance you can download on our website, on the European Commission website. If you just type the Clean Hydrogen Alliance Declaration, you will come immediately to there and you can sign up, and then you are a member of the Alliance. Finally, we launched last week is the Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Observatory. This will help us to track how Europe is progressing in the field. You can see you have a lot of graphs and data and reports, but we will have technology and market, we will have policies and regulation tracking, codes and standards tracking, patent publications, funding, and also education and training. So you can go to the fchobservatory.eu, and there you can really see where we are, and every year we will make a report on how we moved. So that's it. One last thing, we will have a European Hydrogen Week from the 23rd to the 27th of November. So a full week in Europe, we will talk about hydrogen from research to international cooperation through high-level political messages that will come with the CEOs, and through brokerage events and investor pitching events. So that will be the whole week. So for sure, if you would like to know more, follow our newsletter and you will get this information. Thank you very much. And back to the...
Okay, thank you very much, Bart. So it was a very good overview of all of the activities that the joint undertaking has achieved over the years and what's going on at the moment. I think it's fair to say the last year has been a very big year for hydrogen, particularly in Europe. So if there's any questions for people, please send your questions in. In the meantime, obviously it's quite tricky to try and coordinate all these activities with supply and demand in order to get private investors to invest their money as soon as possible, but obviously not to be waiting for a very long time before they start to see some return on their investment. What's your feeling so far, Bart, from these activities? What's your feedback from the private investor community?
Well, we have done for last year, for the first time, last year November, it was in Rotterdam, an investment campaign where we gathered also around 100 capital investors and a lot of our SMEs who were looking for, of course, an investor in order to scale up. And what I learned there is that still a lot of these capital investors, they don't know the technology very well. So my first action actually during that event was to explain what is hydrogen and fuel cell technology, and also what is the policy. So investors are still lacking such kind of information. I have to say that, of course, this is getting now better because you have the European hydrogen strategy, but also hydrogen strategy that was announced. You have the French now, 2 weeks ago, they also announced their hydrogen strategy. So, of course, investors are now hearing all these news now this year. So I do believe that that improves. But nevertheless, we have to be very honest that this is an emerging technology, and it's still not so easy to find immediately, bankable projects or projects that immediately raise already money. So I believe that for us, the next 5 years will be very important to make it a commercial success. I always say that the first joint undertaking from 2008 to 2014 was really to do very low TRL, really working on membranes, on bipolar paste, very basic thing. The second joint undertaking was now, which run ends middle of next year, was about showing that the technology works. Put these things in the field, put them on the street, put them in the houses, and show that it works. But now the next step is really make it a commercial success. It means we have to further reduce the cost, not the capex cost of the instruments or for the products, but also we need to produce cheap hydrogen. And of course, the more you will reduce the cost of this, of course, the more investors that will start to get interested.
Our experience in our consulting business that over the last 6 to 12 months, we have seen many more requests from institutional investors effectively wanting to get educated about, what's hydrogen, what's fuel cells, what are the opportunities, and of course also from insurers as well. So I guess it's important to give this education exercise to the investment community so they understand what it is, what are concrete examples of where it can be, this technology can be implemented and exploited. So I guess where people, the investors want to see, well, okay, we understand now more about the technology, but in terms of the concrete steps of what we feel will happen over the next 5 years to make this a reality, what are the most optimistic prospects that they could invest in? So, well, what's your feeling? Your optimistic feeling is those particular sectors, areas, applications where you think it will happen first?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a very optimistic feeling in the sense that the European Union have now came forward with this new instrument, which they call IPCEI, an important project for common European interest. What does that mean? That means that if you have a couple of countries and a couple of companies from those countries are coming together and they are willing to set up a huge project, for example, putting 5,000 trucks on the road and building 100 hydrogen or 500 hydrogen refueling stations. So this could be, for example, a huge IPCEI project. And then this IPCEI project actually will get a stamp from DG Competition that they do not need to follow the state aid rules. So they will be accepted from state aid rules. And of course, this helps also to make your business cases, because then you will have opportunities for local authorities, national authorities to invest in the companies, and they will have and there will be no problem with state aid rules. So this will, of course, help to start making projects that are become. Where do I see, of course, the first big successes is in the industry and the industrial sectors, like, for example, fertilizers industry, also steel industry, because they have huge demand, and enormously big demand. And so we will need to produce so much hydrogen that the hydrogen will become very cheap. And so then, if we can produce so much hydrogen for this industrial sector, then we can use a little bit of that hydrogen in transport. Because for us today, still hydrogen is very expensive for refueling at the station. So that's why we need to make sure that first we go en masse, thanks to the sector, thanks to the industrial sectors, and then we can slowly moving towards the transportation. But no doubt, industry will be first. And we need to scale up. So if you know that we need, I mean, you see the objective, 6 gigawatt and 40 gigawatt of electrolyzers. Today, if we calculate the 5-6 electrolyzer companies that we have in Europe, maybe with a bit of luck, they can produce 1 gigawatt of electrolyzers altogether in 1 year production volume. So if we need to go to 40 gigawatt, yeah, well, and 40 gigawatt in Europe, and then 40 gigawatt also outside of Europe, yeah, they will need to scale up, and this will be crucial, because if we don't do it in Europe, I'm sure they will do it somewhere else in the world, not to name China, for example. So I think that here we have again such a story like with the solar panels that we have in the past. With the solar panels, Europe was really, I mean, especially Germany then, was really starting to build out their the production, but suddenly everything moved to China. Today, there's very little solar business still. The point is now, how can we avoid that? IPCEI and this Hygiene Alliance is basically our answer to make sure that the investments happen here in Europe fast enough, and that the jobs are created here and the growth not in China. But we are now really at the, I always say, at the point where it's serious now. Now we have to go. Now we need to push through. And if we are hesitant again, like we were with the batteries, like we were with the telecom sector, where we were with the solar panels, if we do it, it will be another sector that Europe will lose. So the Commission has understood that. That's why they made this European hydrogen strategy, while we still are in the leadership in the world on this technology, and to guarantee that we keep that leadership. But it's not a given, and it will require a lot of actors, including the financial, the finance industry sector.
One participant has asked the question, you mentioned maritime transport as a long-term goal. Are there any key points that could accelerate this sector?
Well, yes, IMO, for example, the International Maritime Organization, they need to develop their rules, their standards to put a ship on the sea. Today, every hydrogen ship that we are building built on prototype license. And prototype license, you can imagine, that means that it takes a long time to get your certification that you can go on the sea. Depends very much on interpretation of the text, and also it's very expensive. So we need the IMO to really embark now more faster to put standards for hydrogen propelled ships. On the other hand, what we also, and the IEA report last year showed that, we need to work with the ports authorities, because the ports are fantastic, could be fantastic hydrogen hubs, because most of the time it's not only about maritime, the ships, but also they have a lot of industry there. And sometimes also a lot of chemical industry who needs a lot of hydrogen. So by combining all this and really focusing on the investments on ports, we will also accelerate automatically the transition towards hydrogen and ships. But hydrogen and ships can also be used in two ways. I mean, it can be used in pure hydrogen, and then through fuel cells, for example, which is, of course, its purest form, and you have no emissions. On the other hand, you can also use it for combustion, that you combust your hydrogen. Still, you have some NOx. Or you can move to ammonia, and then ships can be propelled by ammonia, which is also a very interesting carrier, especially when you talk about intercontinental shipping. I will not say that maybe ammonia will play a huge role in, for example, shipping, inland waterway shipping or something. Maybe there pure hydrogen might play a role, but really international shipping, continent shipping, there we believe ammonia could also play a role. Methanol will probably be too expensive on a TCO basis for that. But so anyway, the ammonia will need to be produced also in a green way. That's why we can also use the hydrogen for that.
Thank you very much, Bart, for a very good presentation, a very good explanation and elaboration of the activities of the FCHJU and what's been achieved in the past, and the strategic roadmap for the future. So I think we are now ready to pass across to our next speaker, and our next speaker is waiting for us there now. James Dobbing is ready to be connected right now. So thank you, James. I'll hand over to you. Please give a very brief introduction to yourself and your background, and then we'll go into your presentation. Thank you.
I'm James Dobbing, Senior Policy Advisor in the Hydrogen Economy team in the Department for Business and Energy and Industrial Strategy. So my expertise until recently been working on our hydrogen business models work, recently focusing on developing our hydrogen strategy in the UK. So today, focus on UK activity to accelerate the hydrogen economy. Look to give an overview in terms of where we're at today, the context that is driving the focus on hydrogen here in the UK and in the department, some of the potential, discussion of the challenges, and then move into some of the activities that we're undertaking and some of our priorities for the coming years. So the shift in our recent net zero target is kind of changed the dynamic in the way that hydrogen is perceived here as a decarbonisation option in the UK. And the Committee on Climate Change summed it up quite nicely in saying the difference between an 80% world and a net zero target is striking. Low carbon hydrogen moves from being a useful option to one of the key enablers. And their indication was that updates to policy should reflect that increasing target in terms of action on hydrogen. So the diagram on the right just sums up the scale of the challenge in terms of deploying hydrogen in the UK. The further ambition scenario sets out an increase from up to 270 terawatt hours of hydrogen demand in 2050, and you can see some of the key sectors there being industry, peak heating applications, surface transport, and also shipping as well, and a large scale up in production and complete decarbonisation of those production methods. There's obviously there's a big shift in where we are today. There's a need to move from a decarbonised hydrogen economy to a fully decarbonised hydrogen economy of the future. And the way hydrogen can help play that role is a flexible, decarbonised energy carrier that can enable a reduction in emissions in sectors such as industry and heavy transport, where reducing those emissions using electrification is particularly challenging. In terms of the exact role for hydrogen in 2050, I think it's fair to say that's uncertain, but the range of analysis that's being undertaken at the moment does suggest that significant scale up is needed, and it can play a particular role in those areas where electrification is challenging. I've mentioned the CCC's further ambition scenario, but recent reports, including from Aurora Energy Research, indicated between around 200 and 500 terawatt hours of hydrogen. And the key driver of that being the difference between where you may deploy hydrogen, say in the power sector. In the CCC scenario, that's quite low. In the Aurora Energy Research, that is much higher as well. And areas like decarbonisation of the gas grid using hydrogen as well play a key role in driving that increase in demand in that scenario. So like I say, it's difficult to understand exactly where we will need to be in 2050, but we know that in industry in particular, hydrogen behaves similarly to natural gas, but not exactly the same. And it can help to decarbonise those high temperature processes where electrification is challenging, and also where industrial carbon capture is particularly difficult due to the point source of emissions in those particular sites. Heavy transport, so particularly where you pay the sort of energy density penalty, where batteries are less applicable. So areas such as HGVs. We're seeing some early deployment in rail, the recent announcement alongside COP26, and also deployment of hydrogen buses, such as in Aberdeen and other parts of the UK. In terms of additional routes, so mentioned heating buildings, that's a long-term option, and that compares to other low carbon forms of heating, such as heat pumps or hybrid approaches. And then also thinking about the role of hydrogen in dispatchable power and playing a role alongside CCS-enabled CCGTs. And also thinking about the role that power can play in terms of power to gas, complementing and enabling increasing deployment of renewables, and also addressing issues such as increasing intermittency as you bring more renewable generation onto the system over time. Building onto that, there's the systemic value of hydrogen. It's an energy carrier. It can be produced through a range of different production methods. It can allow integration of both the electricity and gas systems, and also areas such as storage, providing that long-term duration storage option where there's fewer losses compared to areas such as batteries. And this could help provide a more secure energy system for the UK. I think it's important to go back to that point around where we are today. Hydrogen is currently used in the UK today between 10 27 terawatt hours produced. The vast majority of that is not low carbon, so 96% produced from methane reformation used in the chemicals and refining sectors as a feedstock. And very small amounts, only 4% of hydrogen from electrolysis, used primarily in the transport sector in hydrogen refueling stations. All of that demand is outside of the energy system in terms of what we need to decarbonize and help hydrogen enter into those sectors. And that's a significant opportunity, and both working on that domestically and also working with international partners through some of our international initiatives, such as Mission Innovation, the International Partnership for Hydrogen Fuel Cells and Economy, play play an important role in helping us to understand the different drivers for deploying hydrogen across globally, and what that means in terms of the actions that we need to take here in the UK. An important point here as well is thinking when we're scaling up. The UK saw a significant rise in GDP and reduction in emissions in response to the 2008 financial crisis. And again, thinking about the current situation in terms of COVID, we see that the same could be true, and that hydrogen could play a really important role in driving that economic recovery as well as driving deep decarbonisation. As I mentioned, so hydrogen can bring significant opportunities. We're seeing a range of different strategies and announcements coming out from various different countries, including Germany, Norway, the EU, and Japan, the early leaders in terms of hydrogen announcements. But we feel in the UK we have strengths across the value chain in gas production, in infrastructure development and pipelines. I'm thinking about our electrochemical expertise in fuel cells and electrolysis, in automotive, including rail, and also some of the work on boiler manufacture, which we're progressing through our innovation programs. We also have expertise across some of the advanced methane reformation technologies, building on our expertise through companies such as Johnson Matthey. There's also the geographical element in terms of the UK's position, which has both significant offshore wind and renewables potential, but also significant carbon capture and storage potential as well, and maximising those opportunities both in renewable hydrogen generation and CCS-enabled hydrogen production methods it can also play a role in scaling up and creating opportunities for the hydrogen economy. In terms of some of the international announcements that we're following closely, so the Commission's recent hydrogen strategy with the 40 gigawatts of hydrogen ambition, focusing on industrial applications and looking at demand side policies and business models to stimulate uptake, and then also the Hydrogen Alliance and fostering that collaboration between the public and private sector as well is informing our approach. Similarly, thinking about Germany, looking at the supply chain and sector development element of their hydrogen market, thinking about CFD mechanisms to drive demand for low carbon hydrogen, and also thinking about standards as well and what role they can play in establishing a strong hydrogen economy. This slide just sums up some of the key challenges with deploying hydrogen. So these range across the value chain, and some really can only be fully addressed through innovation, commercial demonstration, and deployment. We need to understand and demonstrate carbon capture rates for those production methods that rely on that, and understand what the upstream and residual emissions might be. We also need to think about the potential for a global warming potential of hydrogen, and there's some work that's underway to look at that. And then also look at the potential for negative emissions, so through production methods such as biomass gasification with CCS, and what role that can play in supporting the development of hydrogen and our net zero target. Thinking about the energy inputs and costs and enabling infrastructure that we need to underpin those production methods, demonstrating that we can safely supply and distribute hydrogen, and also thinking about pipeline but also non-pipeline distribution, and the role that can play in distributing hydrogen around the economy. Establishing the role of storage and driving innovation to understand its potential and progress areas such as salt cavern storage, which could play a role. Thinking about the end use and the various different barriers and challenges that face different end use markets to take hydrogen, and identifying what those low regret opportunities are where we can we can demonstrate and show that hydrogen is a cost-effective and viable option for sectors to take up that hydrogen. And we also need to think about the cost gap, which is crucial. Hydrogen is more expensive than alternatives currently, and how can we drive down the costs of production methods, enabling end users to take that hydrogen, and also thinking about the variable costs of current incumbent fuels in those markets, what implications that might have on the design of the business model. And there's also really important elements in terms of sequencing, driving those technologies from innovation through to commercialization stage, and also coordination both of supply and demand, but also thinking about coordinating industry, national government and local government, and how they can all work together to progress hydrogen in their particular location. And we're seeing some really effective work being undertaken by that across the various different regions, and particularly the industrial clusters here in the UK. So this slide just sums up the range of different activities being undertaken across the world to develop hydrogen, and noting that the Bloomberg report estimated a project pipeline worth 90 billion, and that in excess of 30 projects that they identified were based here in the UK, and they were across all elements of the value chain, from production to distribution through to the various different end users. So we're well placed to take advantages of the opportunities of hydrogen, and we can think about how to progress that domestically, and also how we can use our engagement and active participation in international initiatives to share learning and progress shared goals together with various different countries. In terms of where the UK is compared to others, I've mentioned that we have the geographic advantages, in particular around offshore wind potential and CO2 storage and hydrogen storage in salt caverns and depleted oil fields, and that providing us a good framework to be able to expand the hydrogen economy, taking forward a twin track approach for both electrolytic and CCS enabled production methods. Our energy innovation needs assessment identified that there could be a significant economic benefit resulting from developing hydrogen, with up to 5.3 billion of GVA, nearly 50,000 jobs by 2050, and that work closely involved industry in order to derive those figures. There's expertise in terms of the gas networks, so some of our leading work through the Hydroploy project, and also the Hy4Heat project, which is demonstrated that hydrogen ready boilers can be produced, and we have that capability across both the electrolytic and CCS enabled production methods, with companies like ITM Power demonstrating some of the kind of world leading projects in electrolysis, so the Shell Rhineland refinery, but also projects here in the UK, and also Johnson Matthey, who are progressing some of their technologies for advanced methane reformation. But I think it's important not to forget some of the less developed technologies there, so solid oxide fuel cells, and bringing them through the innovation curve as well. So I think, as we heard earlier, industrial clusters and ports offer opportunities for scale. Hydrogen production is already taking place in many of the industrial clusters here in the UK, but that's not low carbon. And the expansion of hydrogen within those clusters provides potential to scale up demand, particularly in the industrial sectors, but also in the heavy transport sectors, such as depot-to-depot transport, in the longer term marine, and also thinking about areas such as gas grid blending and the strategic role that can play, as well as progressing work on hydrogen in the power sector and the role that it can play in providing flexible power generation. For this, I'd just like to focus on the The Humber Cluster is one particular example of some of the things that are going on in the UK, but recognise there's a range of leading activity going across the UK, from the HyNet project in Merseyside, Net Zero Teesside project, and also the Project Acorn in St Ferguson and Grangemouth. The Humber Cluster project's looking at deploying CCS-enabled hydrogen production at scale, and really focusing on decarbonising our heavy industry in the UK. The Humber Cluster being the cluster in the UK with the highest emissions, around 12 megatons total, with its steel sector close by as well. And that project, led by Equinor, is looking to develop a 600 megawatt autothermal reformer ATR to supply that around the cluster, help decarbonise industry, and also decarbonise domestic heating through blending into the gas grid. The estimated reduction in emissions is around 900,000 tonnes per year from that project. So that's showing you the kind of scale that can be generated in emissions reductions through focusing on these clusters. Building on that, there was a recent study conducted by Imperial College London that identified around 3 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production capacity could be deployed to decarbonise all of the industry in that region, alongside other technologies such as carbon capture and storage. This slide just sums up some of the innovation activity that is underway in the UK. So we've got our upcoming announcement of the Energy Innovation Programme in the budget, the 1 billion. But this is the current programme that BEIS and across government are leading, and as well as some of the industry activity as well to progress hydrogen. There's up to £121 million available in innovation, ranging from £33 million through our hydrogen supply competition, £20 million through our storage at scale competition, which is looking at large scale innovative energy storage, and that includes power to gas technologies within that, within the scope of that work. There's the HIFI Heat programme, which is looking at the safety and feasibility of 100% conversion to hydrogen for domestic heating, but that's also looked at the potential for conversion of industrial appliances as well. That closely complements our industrial fuel switching programme, which is looked at the potential fuel switching to low carbon alternatives, so primarily electrification, biomass, and hydrogen. And I think in the most recent phase of that project, all of the programs that have come forward have some hydrogen element as part of that, showing that it really is likely to play a key role in decarbonising that particular sector. And that's also progressing the range of different activities that you need to decarbonise different sectors within industry as a whole. For example, the challenges decarbonising chemicals is very different to decarbonising food and drink. In terms of deployment on the end use side, our Hydrogen for Transport programme has supported the development of hydrogen refuelling stations around the country, and also deployed hydrogen vehicles, so from passenger vehicles through to buses as well, demonstrating that you can use hydrogen in that sector today, and that it can play a role alongside electrification of transport. Some of the other programs that could support the end users, so the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, first phase of that has recently been launched, and that's a £315 million capital fund to support the decarbonisation or energy efficiency improvements in the industrial sector. And then also the Industrial Clusters Mission Programme, which is looking at the development of industrial clusters and looking at progressing areas such as feasibility and demonstration of decarbonising those through a range of methods, including hydrogen production. Some of the other funds which are upcoming, so the recently announced CCS Infrastructure Fund, so that is an £800 million fund to enable the development of CCS infrastructure in industrial clusters, so transport and storage, and that can play a role in unlocking investment in hydrogen production. And similarly, our low carbon hydrogen production fund that we announced back in August 2019 focused on deploying low carbon hydrogen production capacity and driving investment. And I think importantly, it's good to note the work of the regulator Ofgem and some of the industry projects that are being led. So the High Deploy project demonstrating the safety case for blending up to hydrogen in the gas grid, and live work that's going on at Keele University there can play a strategic role in unlocking investment in hydrogen production capacity and addressing areas such as demand risk, while also delivering a decarbonisation benefit to the domestic grid. And then also thinking about some of the feasibility and conversion of the grid to 100% hydrogen through the Network Innovation Programme, and also some of the work on gas billing methodologies as well, which is important in terms of enabling blends of hydrogen to be taken up as part of that. So this slide just sums up a couple of our hydrogen production projects. So just to show there's projects being supported across the production methods, and really looking at some quite interesting programs as well, particularly linking up both supply and demand and how that can be facilitated. So the first project is an ITM Power-led Gigastack project, and that's with support from Ørsted and Phillips 66 refinery, and that's looking at developing a new low-cost 5 megawatt water electrolyzer stack, and also feasibility on a feed study on a 100 megawatt electrolyzer system. And I think that's one of the key challenges in terms of electrolysis, is scaling up and reducing the cost of those systems. The Dolphin Project, looking at coupling electrolysis with floating offshore wind turbines, and they propose an operational start date from summer 2023. And also the HyNet project, which has looked at an engineering study for a large-scale production facility, coupling advanced methane reformation with carbon capture and storage, and looking at deploying that low carbon hydrogen as part of the project to decarbonise industry and homes in the northwest. So that brings us on to some of our priorities for the 2020s. So I think the key point here is that at Environmental Audit Committee recently, the Secretary of State announced that we intend to we plan to publish a hydrogen strategy early next year in advance of the COP26 climate change conference. We recognise that setting out a clear strategic approach to developing hydrogen is essential if we're going to be a leader in producing that low carbon hydrogen across the economy, and focusing on how to continue to support the scale up of low carbon hydrogen demand alongside stimulating demand and capturing the economic benefits, such as developing the supply chain here in the UK, are really critical. And how, again, we can work across international partners to progress shared objectives is really important. A key element of that will be progressing our twin track approach, so how we reduce the cost and scale up electrolyzers alongside the scaling up of CCS-enabled hydrogen production, which can help deliver scale in the near term are key priorities. In terms of some issues which are really important, it's crucial that our strategy is evidence-based, works both government and industry, and that's why we set our Hydrogen Advisory Council up to do that. And also areas such as developing our business models to drive investment and deployment of low carbon hydrogen production will be critical, but also progressing areas such as standards and the regulatory and market framework. Finally, bringing forward our funding programs and allowing capital support to be available to help deploy hydrogen across the value chain will be really important, and thinking forward to our upcoming spending review and what that might mean for hydrogen. So that's everything from me now. Happy to hand back and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for quite a detailed presentation. So we have quite a few questions, we'll try and cover as many as we can in the remaining few minutes. So we have a question regarding the demands for aviation, given the Airbus announcement of zero emissions aviation from 2035 as potentially a possibility, and how many terawatts of green hydrogen would be needed for that. So where is hydrogen for aviation in the hydrogen role in the UK? I mean, obviously, things that are covered already are things like maritime, HGVs, rail, buses, etc. So, what's your view on where hydrogen fits in for aviation?
Sure. So I think the PM announced his Jet Zero project as well, and you know, really focusing on being a world leader in that respect as well. I think the challenge with aviation is it's quite early stage. So there is an innovation project which has been supported. So up in Orkney are looking to demonstrate a hybrid electric hydrogen plane, but that's quite small. I think it's sort of a few seaters and looking to demonstrate it, you know, in the 100-mile range. So I think the point is there's potential there. There's a long way to go in terms of progressing those. There's also other elements in terms of thinking about synthetic fuel markets. So hydrogen can be coupled with CO2 to produce synthetic fuels or biomass, and the role that could play in decarbonising industry through synthetic kerosenes that can be enabled through developing hydrogen as well. I think that's something that we're in contact with the Department for Transport on, who lead that, and thinking about what role that might play. Okay,
well, that's good. So we've had similar questions from a couple of the participants, where they seem to feel that that blue hydrogen with CCS is more favoured or more preferred versus pure green hydrogen with electrolysis. So, you know, is that a fair perception? And if it is that more due to infrastructure, some infrastructure already being in place and therefore having a lower upfront capex?
So I think we're progressing both of the production methods equally. So I think the slide that I had on the hydrogen supply competition sets out, you know, all of those the competition was run equally and fairly, and looks to bring forward those range of technologies. I think the challenges of the production methods are different. So in terms of the challenges for electrolysis, it's cost and scale up that's required, but that technology can be deployed today, and if coupled with renewables is low carbon hydrogen. Methane reformation is you know, supplied at scale today, but it's not low carbon. It requires that CCS infrastructure to actually be developed. So I think there's challenges in that respect too. The scale that you can deliver with CCS enabled production, if the infrastructure comes forward, is much greater, and what that can do is help to enable a scale up of electrolysis and help to build the market as well. So there's a balance of how both production methods can can help to meet our net zero target. We're progressing both of those equally, but also thinking to the long term in terms of 2050 world. Really, that's where you need to be reducing your emissions even more and moving towards a kind of green electrolytic hydrogen scenario in greater volumes as well. So it's a balance of both approaches, and both can play a complementary role in supporting each other.
Okay, well that's great. Thanks, James. So thank you for your time and the very detailed presentation. We will now move on to the panel discussion, and we have with us Veronica Noon, Nigel Curson, and Claire Jackson, who are our esteemed panelists this afternoon. So if each of you could give just a very brief introduction to yourself, and then we have quite a few questions lined up. So let's go.
Okay, shall I?
Yes. Yes.
Hi, Jackson. I run the Hydrogen Task Force, and we are sort of group of some of the companies that are leading on hydrogen in the UK across the value chain, and we've sort of come together to sort of develop a joint vision for hydrogen in the UK, and then a sort of collective position on what the next steps are that industry and government need to take together to make that vision a reality. So we are looking to make the sort of high level energy system, environmental and economic case for hydrogen in the UK.
Veronica?
Hi, greetings from Edinburgh. Veronica Noon, Scottish Enterprise. I head up our renewable energy and emerging technologies, which include hydrogen and CCUS. We are obviously interested as a National Economic Development Agency in the supply chain opportunities that there are for hydrogen, and we think they are many and varied. And James put it very eloquently, the balance there between blue and green hydrogen. We see real opportunities for both within Scotland, and have been working very closely with the Scottish Government around their emerging hydrogen assessment. Yeah, just really interested in the various presentations I've heard this afternoon, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Veronica. And Nigel, a brief introduction.
Yep, Nigel Curzon from Pensman. We're an international midstream oil and gas consultancy. Initially, in terms of my background, I started working in the North Sea and offshore platforms, and I've got about 15 years experience of subsea pipelines and infrastructure, about 15 years of asset management infrastructure, pretty much oil and gas related. I now run a consultancy within Penspan, so we're working on CO2 sequestration projects and hydrogen projects, and doing hydrogen related research. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Nigel. So let's kick off the questions with regard to supply and demand. So what are the panelists' view on how the UK could incrementally build demand and supply in the most cost-effective manner? So anyone, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, sure. So I'm sort of happy to on this. I think it is really crucial that these two things come sort of in tandem together. I think we've seen quite a lot of focus recently, I think, in the UK on stimulating supply and getting sort of support for production up and running. But it will be sort of really critical that actually we continue to and invest in the demand side technologies, and that support isn't just restricted to the sort of supply and production side of things. I think this myth that if you can, create hydrogen production and scale that up, that the demand side will take care of itself, is just that. It's a myth. And I think some of the work that we've been doing with the Hygiene Task Force on some of the sort of economic sort of side of things, our sort of view is that in terms of support for that supply and demand, that a sort of 1-to-1 ratio in terms of every pound that you invest in supply and production, sort of corresponding pound needs to be invested in everything that's downstream of that, be it both the sort of transmission and distribution storage infrastructure, and also the demand side technologies such as transport and hydrogen boilers, etc., etc. So I think having some coordination between those two things, not just looking at them in isolation, that whole picture together will be really important.
Okay, thanks. Any comments, Nigel or Veronica?
Yeah, I think.
I would.
Sorry, carry on.
Okay, sorry, I would concur with that view about taking demand and supply together. It's not enough to say you've got a massive supply and the demand will somehow appear at the other end. I think we have to aim to secure a resilient and cost-effective, and at the same time have a very clear of where the demand is for that. And we see projects such as the Aberdeen Hydrogen Hub, which is a case in point, is trying to grow the scale of demand to unlock commercial supply and also to attract private investment. And I think once we've cracked this nut through pilot projects, we'll then start to see the market start to respond to the opportunity. And at that point, I think that's when we really need to start to scale up to try and unlock competitive and commercial supply of hydrogen into the market.
I think from my point of view, it's clear this is a very a multi-step process. And I think the industrial clusters that are currently being significant investments being put into it from a developmental point of view around the UK. There, I think you've got a demand and the supply right next to it. I mean, if you take a net zero Teesside, for example, the Humber area, you can land gas there. You can use ATR or SMR to manufacture hydrogen, and also they're very close. They're very close to a sequestration site as well. So I think industrial clusters are 19% of UK emissions currently. So I think if you can keep those businesses competitive, which is about probably contracting for difference on the sequestration, so they're no worse off. I think industrial clusters are the best place to start. And if you're going to build SMRs and ATRs, you want to sweat those assets as much as possible. They're big investments. So the obvious demand, the obvious demand is from spiking 20% hydrogen into gas and using it for domestic supply. You can kind of ramp that up to about 20% and still using existing infrastructure. So I think that's a very important part of it. So to get things going. So
okay. So so with these industrial clusters, do you think they are sufficient on their own to stimulate the kind of demand that we need in these stages, or do you think there's what's the next stage after that, or what further needs to be done to stimulate demand to the level that the country needs, both for decarbonisation as well as to stimulate the necessary private investment upstream on the supply side?
Oh, well, I think there's sort of any number of things that you could say here. So I think that there needs to be a fairly rapid change to the GSMR to allow blending, which would also provide a sort of, I guess, a backstop demand for hydrogen, which would sort of decrease the risk in terms of some of those early stage production projects. There's certain other things that we need to do in various other areas in order to sort of provide that sort of pathway. So we need to get moving on live trials of 100% hydrogen heating. That needs to happen in the next sort of 12 months. We need to get started with that. And then sort of on the transport side of things, I think, as you rightly said, I think a lot of this stuff a lot of the sort of bulk applications will sort of come out of those industrial clusters. But we still need to be working on those sort of transport applications as well. And we need to provide the right environment for those technologies to come to the UK. We're seeing HGV trials happening in other places in Europe. They're not happening in the UK at the moment. So those things need to change in order to create an environment in the UK which is attractive for those kinds of technologies.
Good. Veronica?
Yeah, I mean, I do see a really early role for the transport sector, the heavy vehicle sector, and council fleets, for instance, to create the demand. We're also seeing quite a lot of activity in Aberdeen and Dundee around hydrogen buses. So I think these are a good place to start. I think subsequent project phases would be looking to supply marine and rail customers ultimately with green hydrogen as well. In industry, I think probably smaller scale to start, but targeting those industries, for instance, for us in Scotland, probably the ones that use the Scottish brand as part of their proposition. So for instance, the whisky industry was a good place to start. Many of the smaller distilleries are close to renewable, natural fit to see these demonstration markets start to unlock. But over and above that, we're also seeing some other early enablers, including rural communities, island communities, Orkney in the Western Isles, where they have an ambition to become energy independent using local renewable sources and smart local energy systems. And these sorts of activities can actually rapidly drive change and learning if the right support in terms of innovation and seed funding is
Great.
provided.
Nigel, do you have any more thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I think an incredibly important part of adopting hydrogen is the transportation system. I mean, I think it's likely it'll start off with industrial clusters, but how do you get it? How do you get it to the rest of the nation as 100% hydrogen? And I think 20% in domestic supply is an incredibly important stepping stone because it de-risks production. But at the end of the day, to me, our target has got to be 100%. And switching cities over, to 100% in one go it's absolutely not practical at all. So there's a whole rake of things that need to be done before that can happen. And I think one of those things is actually dual supply. Effectively, you need a hydrogen transportation system. Brings 100% hydrogen to city gates within cities, and then you can then switch over that city bit by bit. Before you do that, you've got to obviously all those domestic users are going to have hydrogen ready appliances, and then you can slowly and systematically switch people over. But once you've got that transportation infrastructure in place for hydrogen, then I think that makes everything a lot easier, because pipelines are an incredibly cost-effective way of moving things around. So that will give you access to freight sites, to transportation hubs. So I think the transportation is the key to the rest of it beyond industrial clusters.
Thanks for that, Nigel. So moving on a bit from what we've so far been talking about is primarily the large-scale industrial sector, infrastructure, etc. So you have, quite large demand, quite large supply, but only a relatively small number of customers, decision makers, if you like, people who understand, spreadsheets, the business case, financial case, etc. But moving beyond that sector, moving out of the industrial sector into commercial and domestic sector, how do we communicate? How do we communicate more effectively with those other sectors where we're dealing with millions of decision makers effectively, and we need to communicate with them in a different way than presenting a business model to a large company? So how do we more effectively communicate with these sectors, the residential, domestic, and the commercial sector, to help them make the decision, both in their purchasing choices, in order to drive their demand for hydrogen? Because there's not enough to say, we'll put all this investment in place, infrastructure in place, when the bulk of the people in the country don't understand what it's all about and why should they change. So, Claire, what's your big communication strategy?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think this is something that's really, really important. The energy transition impacts everybody, every person in the UK, every business in the UK. And we have to bring people along with us on that journey. I think there's some elements of it which are more important than others. I don't think the public needs to have a huge understanding, as you said, of some of those industrial applications of hydrogen. But when it comes to putting hydrogen in people's homes, it's super important that we are communicating why it's safe, why it's a good idea, and how that's going to work in sort of practice. I think part of that is around the communication that, part of that wider communication that there is going to be a change. There are lots of different options, and I don't think any of us around this table would say that hydrogen is the only option. But it's about communicating that hydrogen has a valuable role to play. And I think depending on the application depends on who's the best person to communicate that and how it should be done. At the Hydrogen Task Force on the heat side of things, we have involvement from everyone from the sort of gas networks to appliance developers, who all have communication strategies and are doing some work around at the moment around the sort of what perceptions of hydrogen are at the moment and what we can do to sort of bring people along on that journey. But you're absolutely right. There's millions of stakeholders here, and it's not necessarily a sort of one size fits all in terms of the way that we engage and communicate with them.
Yes, I guess when everybody's heard about Hindenburg, so You know, that old myth keeps coming up and up all over again.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so in another project that I run, the Hygiene Hub is much more sort of public facing in terms of the public. And we've sort of found that there's a real generational gap in terms of people's perceptions of hydrogen. The younger you are, the more it's just an exciting bit of technology. We sort of don't get a huge number of questions around sort of safety or explosiveness or any of those kinds of things. But I think obviously some of the sort of less some of the hydrogen related incidents that we somewhat more regrettable sort of, I guess the sort of living memory of that sort of sits with some of the sort of older generation. But I think communicating the safety case for hydrogen is going to be absolutely critical for the changeover, both in transport and in heat. And if we don't get that piece right, consumers will reject it. So it's really important that we do that.
Okay, thank you, Claire. I hope you weren't referring to me when you were talking about the older generation.
Absolutely not, Peter.
I wasn't around during the war. So Veronica, what's your feeling about how to communicate with those of us who are not of the millennial generation?
That would be me then. Somewhere in between, I would say, the older and the millennial. Yeah, I mean, it's complex. There are lots of stakeholders. I think we just need to be mindful of the audience. We need to get that safety message across, but equally, when it comes to domestic use in homes and cooking, you know, you've got something there which is actually very, very close to the use of gas. So it's easy, it's very simple, and it wouldn't take an awful lot to transfer that in people's minds once you got across that safety hurdle. I think, yeah, there's a big job here because obviously hydrogen's multifaceted energy vector, cuts across a whole range of zero carbon energy systems. So the challenge is trying to understand where we can capitalize on the opportunity. And I think one of the things we can communicate there is the potential benefits to the supply chain and jobs. And it's not just about growth, it's also about a just transition. So I think, you know, we can help to secure a future for our existing high value supply chain. We need to make sure that it doesn't erode. I think this is something that can be communicated. We don't want it to erode and disappear as we fossil fuels, and you know, we need to think about how we avoid further offshoring of our energy intensive industries as well. So all of that's really, really important in how we get the information across. It's horses for courses. We need to think very, very clearly about communication at all kinds of different levels. At the moment, we're talking to utilities, talking to those in the know about this, the vector, and we need to make sure that we're telling the story.
So Nigel, in terms of communication, is it your feeling that out there, shall we say in the commercial sector, for example, that there's much known about hydrogen, concerns of people, how they can be educated to understand the need to do this and the benefits of it?
I think most people are only very broad, very vaguely aware of what's going on with in terms of hydrogen. They'll have seen something about it, something in the papers perhaps, but so I think it's incredibly important that part of it's managed very well. I mean, public opinion can be a very positive thing, a very negative thing. I remember the Brent Spa, and all the issues with shale gas and other things. So I think the normal media channels that people are used to these days, modern media channels, are very important. And I think champions for the cause, people that people will trust. And I don't think it's probably the majority won't be interested in the exact science of it. It's the kind of general principle of it. And I think one thing to bear in mind, of course, is that we switched from a gas that was predominantly hydrogen, or 30 to 50% hydrogen, depending on where it comes from, to natural gas, and now we're switching back again. So it's not the first time that we've been using hydrogen as a fuel. So yeah, obviously a very important part of it. And I know there's a lot of work being done on this already.
I guess some of the advances, say in the last 10, 15 years, for example, are things that people can see, such as solar panels on roofs or battery electric vehicles. It's something they can see and something they can touch and they can understand immediately, the benefits of these. But I guess with something like hydrogen, obviously, you can't see it or touch it or smell it. So it's quite a hard thing to communicate, isn't it? Hydrogen and fuel cells. So I guess there's a challenge there for all of us to communicate that. Yes, it can be a difficult issue. I live in a small village in the Cotswolds, and many years ago they voted not to be connected to the natural gas grid because they didn't want any of that strange stuff in the village. So there you go. Hopefully the world's moved on. So in context of all these things we're discussing, looking to the future, what will we need to see happen in the next 5 to 10 years and further out to coordinate all these activities across all of the sectors of large scale industrial, commercial, residential, domestic? What's in your minds, what are the 3 different views of our panelists there as to what you feel this roadmap is for the next 5 to 10 years to make concrete steps to progress forward, and how all of this can be coordinated so that we're not missing opportunities, but at the same time not doubling up on things we don't need to do. So what's your feeling, Claire?
So I would say there's a few things really. Firstly is that we need to get the UK hydrogen strategy right. I think that coordination and joined up approach will be really important, as you said, to make sure that we're not doubling up on things, but also making sure that the things that are coming forward in the UK aren't just isolated things that we hope will join up one day, but are actually sort of coordinated. I think we need an ambitious program of investment in the UK, both in hydrogen production and in infrastructure and demand side technologies. I think we need, as I said earlier, to move one step forward in each of those different areas. So for hydrogen for heating, we need to see live trials of hydrogen heating. We need to prepare the UK by mandating hydrogen-ready boilers from 2025, and we need to make an amendment to the GSMR to allow blending. And then on the transport side of things, again, we need to have ambition. We need to set targets for refueling stations in the next 5 years, and we need to put together a support program that will allow hydrogen production and those demand side back to base fleets of larger vehicles to be deployed in the UK. So I think those for me are the next steps that we need to do right now in the next 12 months, by the end of the year, immediately. We're going to see the benefit of hydrogen in the next 5, 10 and beyond years. Yeah.
Veronica?
Yeah, I mean, again, absolutely agree with all of that. Policy, strategy, ambitious targets, all of that will really, really help this move. We have to decide whether we want to go for small-scale green production using local renewable energy, for instance, co-located near to demand, or look at large-scale green using offshore wind, for instance. It connects to some form of network, or even blue hydrogen, which would be large-scale and supply a hydrogen network as well. So for me, the strategy at UK and Scottish level is really, really important. We then need to, as I said earlier, really rapidly scale up demand to unlock competitive and commercial supply of hydrogen. I think transport's a key and early enabler. I think I'm hearing everybody else say that as well. We need to demonstrate supply and demand at the same time. So demonstrator projects are really important, but what we do need to do is join them up more effectively. We need to make sure that our current approach, which can be a little bit siloed in certain areas, sees the linkages between different demonstrator projects in different areas, so that we can pool the learning and drive forward models that don't rely too much ultimately on a public purse to deliver. So having the clear targets supported by government will help to accelerate activity and give the market, I think, much more certainty to invest. And if done in the right way, I think we can also unlock supply chain activity and growth, which is where I have a real interest. And this is what I suppose we're trying to do in Scotland via bringing together different projects around the Hydrogen Coast concept, which is a cluster of projects delivering innovative hydrogen solutions. I think as well, innovation is absolutely key. We need to bring the cost down relative to other vectors. We need to think about how we support our supply chain to transition into hydrogen, and how we accelerate activities that engage academia, small and medium-sized enterprises, and wider industry to develop the sort of next generation technology as well that can plug gaps in our own capability. So for instance, next generation electrolyzers for the marine environment. So those sorts of things I think are absolutely important, essential.
Great.
For
we have a couple of final questions I'll join together, and I'll address these to Nigel. Some questions from the floor. One of them is, to what extent do you think the UK will be self-sufficient in hydrogen production, and what role will imports, exports play? And I think this links in quite neatly to another question concerning UK ports. So what are there, in your, from your knowledge of the industry, what measures are being planned for handling of multiple fuel types at UK ports? For example, bunkering of ammonia and hydrogen. And so what role do you think this will play in terms of, if there's a need to import large quantities of hydrogen or a hydrogen carrier such as ammonia, or maybe even export?
Yeah, I think that really important point about in terms of importing hydrogen. I mean, in terms of the first question really about self-sufficiency, I think it's a stepwise thing. Obviously, we're going to be building ATRs, SMRs, on the coast close to carbon sequestration. That's very much a phased process. Obviously, we're going to be producing hydrogen from offshore wind, and eventually, the same thing is going to happen all around the world. So, eventually there will be like a hydrogen market effectively, so we can sell and buy hydrogen. Because we know that it's possible to produce it cheaper potentially than we can in areas that are very, very blessed with solar power, for example. And of course, the other vector is ammonia. Ammonia is another important energy vector, and I know that Australia is looking at producing ammonia and selling it to Japan. So there could be the ammonia economy could come from this. In terms of bunkering, hydrogen is as a supercooled liquid is a very low temperature. So there's some development required to store liquid hydrogen at ports. Ammonia is a lot easier, of course, because it's effectively a liquid at close to atmospheric pressure. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that response, Nigel. And if I can sort of follow on from what you said, I can plug a presentation that I'm giving in these sessions on Thursday at 12:30, which is specifically about ammonia coming in from other countries. I think Claire knows something about this. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Veronica, Claire, and Nigel. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your response to the questions and your thoughts on these topics. And so now we'll move across to our next speaker, Paul Dodds, and who's ready to come in right now. So thank you, Paul.
Okay, so my name is Paul Dodds. I'm an academic at University College London, and I'm talking today about opportunities for hydrogen fuel cell technologies to contribute to clean growth in the UK, which I kind of feel like half of my conclusions have been stolen already, but so I'm not going to conclude anything that's radically different, I don't think, to what you've already heard. But perhaps I've got a bit more evidence, a bit of additional evidence to share with you, which might hopefully be of interest. I'm here on behalf of the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Research Hub, this EPSRC Supergen Hub, which is an EPSRC program which covers the whole hydrogen fuel cell space and essentially tries to represent the academic community of the UK in hydrogen fuel cells. One of the activities that we do is to publish white papers. So we've done a number that you can see in the top right here on heat, energy security, future energy systems, and economic impacts. And the most recent one that we've done is this one, which is opportunities for hydrogen fuel cell technologies to contribute to clean growth. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So there's 4 overall questions explored in this report, looking at how we might use hydrogen fuel cells, what's the research and innovation capacity, what are the potential opportunities and benefits, and what actions are needed to encourage innovation. And I'm going to talk through some of those here, particularly on the final 3. And I should say that some of you might have attended the webinar where we launched this event a few months ago, and some of the slides here are different, so don't just run off straight away. There are a few updates and a few changes here, and this is one of them. So the first thing I think we need to think about is what sort of process we should actually go through to identify opportunities for hydrogen fuel cell technologies. So far, we've been talking about various sectors. So we just had a talk about the transport sector. A few people saying that that's going to be a clear starter. And we've also talked a lot about industry. Not so much about heat, interestingly. Now, I wanted to think about what sort of process you might go through to decide where you should try and support hydrogen and fuel cells. And I have included fuel cells here, and I appreciate until now the focus has very much been on hydrogen. But the two often tend to work together, and the fuel cell market is very much more developed than the low carbon hydrogen market at the moment. So what I've tried to do is put together a diagram here, and it's a Venn diagram. It's got 3 broad areas. We might want to consider what the UK market demand is. I mean, we want there to be a long-term demand to justify investments now, but we also need a short-term demand in order to actually build and sell things. And so we need to know what the UK market demand is. We need to know what the global market demand is, because that will tell us about export opportunities and potentially about imports that will undermine our own industries, of course. And finally, we need to think a little bit about UK innovation strengths in hydrogen fuel cells. And I would argue that we need to do this by each sector. So we've already had a discussion about how each of the sectors is quite different. So transport is quite different to industry, which is quite different to heat. Some things, such as heat, might be mostly a UK focus, where there isn't much demand abroad. And if the UK doesn't find solutions using hydrogen, then nobody else will. So that's up to us to fix. In other areas, there might be a lot of competition from abroad coming into the UK market, and in other areas there might not be much of a UK market, but there might be a global market, but we might still have UK companies working in that market. So I think we need to think about where the UK is going, but we also need to think about the rest of the world and where that is going in order to think about what the opportunities are, where we should put support. And if I put my hat on as the government, now at some point, if we're talking about the next 5 years, we're talking about supporting the hydrogen fuel cell industry. It's going to come down to subsidies. And we've already seen James Dobing from BASE talking about the various programs that BASE have launched, which are essentially subsidies, demonstration projects to try and identify early industries and build early industries and learn more about the potential strengths of hydrogen fuel cells, particularly hydrogen. But if I have my government hat on, I need to show value to the taxpayer, and I want to know how I can maximize the impact of all of the subsidies I give to the sector, but I also want to be able to minimize their total cost. So I want to make sure they have a lot of impact, but I also don't want to spend too much. And that's very difficult to achieve in practice. but that's a government concern, so it's something that we need to think about too, I think. Now, if I look in the long term, we currently use about 0.7 million tons, 700,000 kilotons of hydrogen each year. And here I have three scenarios for 2050, how much hydrogen we might use in 2050 across different sectors. I'm not going to go into detail about these, but hydrogen consumption increases to somewhere between 3 and 19 million tons within the UK. So we think that there is going to be a big market there. And we'd expect similar developments in other countries. So we've seen markets for fuel cells already developing in several countries, particularly in Asia. And there's forecasts that there could be 500 million tons of hydrogen used worldwide by 2050. So that's quite a large market to potentially sell into. But at this point, while we're thinking about the global markets, it's worth saying, first of all, that the fuel cell market is much more mature than the low carbon hydrogen market. So, for example, by 2015, that we were getting on for 200,000 micro CHP fuel cells already installed in Japan, which is a huge number. And with that, there is a global race that people have hinted at to subsidize and fast track hydrogen and fuel cell innovation. So we see Germany putting in billions. We've seen Japan putting in billions over many years, and also Korea, the USA to a bit of a lesser extent. And this works. So you can see this graph on the right. You can see as the price per system has reduced through innovation, through learning by doing, as the number of installations has increased in a classical way, according to innovation theory. And if the UK doesn't invest similarly, then the UK is going to be left behind. I mean, there is a race, and subsidies can fast track innovation. So as part of this report, we tried to work out what the UK strengths were in hydrogen fuel cells. We identified almost 200 businesses working on H2FC, and they're located across the UK, which is nice because one of the government's strategies in the industrial strategy is about place and trying to encourage growth across the country. We found companies have a range of sizes. So large multinationals tend to have small hydrogen or fuel cell operations, while the micro companies and the small companies tend to have a greater or a total focus in this sector. This is an attempt to categorize these business operations into end-use hydrogen supply chain, electrochemical innovation, and services. So we see that companies do operate across the supply chain, and the number of companies, though, reflects the size of the market. So there's a greater focus on fuel cells than there is on hydrogen at the moment. Transport applications are the largest area, despite potentially not being the most important area for the UK in the future. That globally, they have been the most important area, with the exception of those micro CHPs in Japan and to a lesser extent Korea. And finally, what's really worth knowing is that the UK is particularly strong in services in general, and that's reflected in this sector too. So it's strong in services across the economy, but we see a large number of firms providing consulting and engineering services already within the hydrogen and fuel cell space. If we take a look at the raw number of patents that the UK produces, within this area, the number of patent families, it suggests that the UK is weaker than its key competitors. As you can see in this graph, the UK is at the bottom. However, if we look at patents overall, what we see is that the UK has historically invested less than competitor countries in all types of energy research. So it actually has a higher share of global hydrogen fuel cell patents than it does of other low carbon energy patents. It's more specialist in hydrogen fuel cells than it is in other low carbon energy, essentially. And that means, and this is another graph that shows a similar thing, that the hydrogen fuel cells is low carbon energy strength. And that suggests that it's an area that the UK could make some hay in. And also it's interesting to note that the strength of the UK has increased a lot since 2010, between 2010 and 2015. So I'm very sorry about that. So it might not have made much sense in that case, what I've said so far. But that was the diagram. That was the innovation space, where we see the reduction in cost with cumulative innovation installations. that's a map of UK businesses. This is the categorization of UK businesses. This is the patents from each country. And you see the UK is at the bottom there in terms of the number of patent families. But the UK is a bit stronger than other countries, and we can see how it's become more strong. Hydrogen fuel cells has become a greater strength for the UK relative to other energy technologies since 2010 in this graph. Okay, and I was up to here. So this is about universities, and it's interesting that in all areas of hydrogen and fuel cells, we have a reasonable number of universities. We have at least 10 universities that do have research programs. So we do have academic strength. And that's reflected in our publications. So this graph shows our publications, which more or less map worldwide publications in terms of the overall trend. As part of this work, we went out and asked businesses about what the strengths of the UK were and what the challenges for UK companies were. So interestingly, 2/3. So we asked all 196 companies, and I think about 32, maybe 35 companies responded to the survey. So this isn't by any means the whole sector, but it's at least a decent snapshot. And of those, say, 32 companies that responded to us, 66%, 2/3, export goods into the globally. So the companies have a really global focus. 60% of the companies have joint research and development programs with the EU, and 33% with North America. So that's important. There is working, and not just within the UK, but also outside the UK. And the majority of the companies work with UK universities, and thought that the broad expertise and the quality of the research in the UK was very good. So they were all three really positive findings about the UK sector. However, there's a number of barriers that we identified too. Access to finance was a key barrier, and it was considered easier to access in North America and East Asia. The size of the UK market was a barrier. It's so small. Even so, although fuel cells are market ready, costs need to be reduced further through scaling up production. And the market for bulk hydrogen, while it's expected to grow in the coming decade, it's not there at the moment. And that's a key issue for companies. Because you can't do innovation and learning by doing unless you're actually out there selling products, you have people using the products, and you have income streams to actually justify further developing them. Finally, interestingly, there was a shortage of skilled labour in the UK. So the UK was perceived to have a shortage compared to competing countries for this sector, which is something that maybe I'm not sure if that's felt more widely, but if it is, then it's an issue that maybe we need to address through more training or university courses and such like. So I thought I'd try and stick my neck out and say what my opinion on opportunities and needs for UK companies over the next 5 years is. So very much of the company hat rather than an institutional hat. So in terms of opportunities, I think the UK, like any country, it has 200 companies. Some of those companies have world-leading technologies, some have average technologies, and some struggle a bit. I mean, that happens in all sectors, and that's good. But it's important, I think, that we do focus on which technologies are world-leading. There are some that could have a significant impact globally, particularly around hydrogen production and micro-CHP fuel cells. And I think ideally we would try and develop those technologies domestically and use them domestically, and make sure there is a domestic market so they can get the development and achieve the potential that they currently have. That doesn't mean I want to exclude all of the other technologies. I mean, by all means, we need to have a pretty broad base. That's very important. But for the ones that we think might be world leading, we really should make sure that they have a role. We've already talked about heavy duty vehicles, particularly in urban fleets, as an option, and I absolutely agree with that. As an opportunity for the next few years, you can address local air pollution issues and climate change at the same time. The fact that you have them in fleets well, the fact that you have them in urban areas makes the value of reducing air pollution much higher, and the fact you've got them in fleets makes it much easier to actually supply the hydrogen in the absence of a national hydrogen supply system. Industry is a potential user of hydrogen. We've already discussed that too. I mean, there's a perennial problem of high carbon competition from overseas and how you get around that. And because industry uses a huge amount of hydrogen, that means there's a huge amount of energy. So would use a huge amount of hydrogen potentially. That means that the subsidies could end up being quite high if the cost of hydrogen was very much higher than the cost of the existing fuels, natural gas or whatever. And finally, I talked about industrial services earlier on, and the UK has historically been very good at doing things such as engineering integration, consulting, financial services, and if you do build even a small manufacturing industry, you can then build up all of these add-on services, and they could be particularly strong for exports too. So I think there's some opportunities there. I don't think we should just focus on on technologies that we can manufacture within the UK. We should look wider than that. There's quite a few needs, and I'm not sure, I probably could have thought of more needs if I'd used a smaller font or had more space for this page. So having a sufficiently large skilled and innovative workforce is important, as I just talked about. That's seen as an issue. Having a diverse range of companies. So if you want to have a sector that is healthy, you really want to have a diverse range of companies in the sector. You need enough you need enough companies so that some can go bust, and then when the people go, and if they do, and that happens in all sectors, the IP can be moved to other companies. The people who work there, the talented engineers, can move to other companies, and you don't lose that. And so you need enough companies, but and those companies need to compete. I mean, you need to have some competition because that can drive innovation, but you also need cooperation. And to think that the UK, while there is a UK market and people will compete over that, there's a much bigger world market out there, and it might be that only by working together that you can really crack that. So I think you need to look through at both competition and cooperation. We need sufficient funding and other support for research and development and for market development to enable innovation. So that means subsidizing end users where necessary, contributing towards R&D, and making sure that there aren't funding blocks in the system that stop the development of technologies at the outset. Okay. We need to think about removal of regulatory and infrastructure barriers. So, for example, it's very hard to justify selling cars or lorries if you don't have refueling infrastructure. It's very hard selling green hydrogen if you don't have a definition of what green hydrogen is, and you don't have a scheme to actually say that a particular amount of hydrogen is green or is not green. It's very hard to sell it as green. So that's an issue that generally would be addressed by the government. We need to think about how to address unfair competition from overseas. So I'm thinking particularly for industry there, where you might have high carbon industries overseas that would export goods to the UK and undermine UK low carbon goods. And so you might use something like carbon taxation, but that falls foul of WTO rules potentially, and so that's an issue that needs to be sorted out on the international stage. Finally, I think it's important that we coordinate innovation funding, building appropriate research institutes and other such areas in order to support industrial development. We don't want it to be too haphazard, and that's always a real risk. So my last three slides, I'm going to jump through them very quickly. Within the report, we identified 12 actions. And if you want to know more about them, then I'd very much recommend you pick up the report, and there's lots of background information. But I want to very briefly go through them here. So first of all, we wanted to think about subsidies and where subsidies might be usefully applied. And we came up with fleets of fuel cell vehicles and industry as well. In the longer term, maybe we'll start thinking about heat, but in the shorter term, they seem to be the most obvious area. But particularly where we already use hydrogen, so for ammonia production or oil refining, methanol production and such like. in terms of removing barriers, I've already mentioned creating a national refueling station network for public and private use, and also creating a green hydrogen standard scheme for the UK, so we can put a value on green and blue hydrogen that can be recognised by the market. From a strategy perspective, we've already heard that BASE plan to publish a hydrogen strategy early next year. Now, we thought that was important. And in this case, we actually thought it might be useful to have separate hydrogen strategy and electrochemical strategies. So the electrochemical strategies would cover batteries, fuel cells, and electrolyzers, and hydrogen strategies would cover everything else to do with hydrogen. And in each strategy, it would be important to try and coordinate innovation funding from the various bodies to consider how it's best invested between industry and academia, and to account for skills needs in the sector. There's been a real proliferation of hydrogen organizations recently, and I'm not sure I'm not sure whether it would be helpful or not to create another one, but certainly when we wrote this a few months ago, we thought it would be useful to have a hydrogen partnership which could accelerate a shift to hydrogen energy systems, and that would be a public-private partnership. Finally, we were interested in how we could build a vibrant innovation ecosystem in the UK. So this is very much looking at the growth part of the clean growth. And part of this is really to study what actually constitutes critical mass in these sectors. So in terms of how much industrial strength do you need, how much academic capability do you need, what sort of skills and knowledge base do we have, and what do you need really to get a critical mass for a growing industry that can meet the UK's needs and hopefully be an export industry. I'm not sure we really have a good understanding of that. Well, certainly I've never seen anything that really does that. We tried to start the process of doing that within this paper, but it's very much only a start. We thought it might be useful to have a couple of institutes, so longer term or long-term research bodies that can build expertise in hydrogen and in electrochemical technologies to focus on the future use of these technologies in the energy system. And finally, given how much cooperation there is overseas, but particularly with Europe, where 60% of the people responding to our survey collaborate with European companies, and many of them sell into Europe. We thought it was important that there were mechanisms for UK researchers and companies to continue to build on those existing collaborations with European counterparts and to access the European markets. So that's all I want to say now. So you can download this report. I'd be very happy to give you feedback, to take any feedback from you about what I've been saying today or about the report in general. I'm very sorry that you didn't see the first 10 slides, or at least you only had about 5 or 10 seconds on each of them. But I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. So we have a question from the floor. I mean, obviously you've looked extensively at published information to file this report. So have you come across a current hydrogen market and projection for the next 5 to 10 years? Something fairly comprehensive. Obviously, there's a lot of information out there, but something obviously very current and up to date, and that factors in all the potential supply and demand side information as projected over the next 5 to 10 years.
That's a very good question. I'm trying to. The closest I get would be, and there's been a couple of studies for FCHJU who've looked at supply chains. There's been a huge number of roadmaps out there. So we have one for the UK that's a number of years old, and one of the recommendations we had in this report was let's go out and update it. And generally, if anybody does a roadmap, they will think about a little bit about long-term stuff, but they also think about some short-term market size. It's very hard to tell, and I mean, I'd probably be a little bit skeptical even if there was one, to be honest. So to give you an example, it depends what's driving the market size. So if we know there's going to be 7 billion of subsidies put in, and we've got an approximate idea of how much activity that's going to encourage, then great. So we can make an estimate. But what I would hope in the next 5 to 10 years is that we're getting to the point where where hydrogen technologies are really starting to compete commercially, which they haven't done in the past, and not be reliant on subsidies, at least in some niches. And at that point, sometimes things can take off. So we saw what happened with solar, we saw what happened with wind, where the size of the market absolutely took off in no time at all, and we ended up with far more solar and far more wind than we expected. Now, in some cases in the UK, that the solar subsidised, but the subsidies were a little bit too generous, a little bit more generous than was necessary, and people jumped on the bandwagon. And so even when you have the subsidies, it's very hard to predict exactly how much take-up you will have. It's a bit of a fool's game to guess. So I've seen a number of studies that do it. I haven't really seen a worldwide one for the next 5 or 10 years that I would kind of trust. But that's partly because it's very hard to do.
So one last question before we move on to the panel discussion is that how important do you feel it is to align the UK's hydrogen strategy with that of the EU, or indeed of the US or Asia, Japan, China, Korea? I mean, given that there's no global hydrogen strategy, do you feel there's the pros and cons of trying to align the UK strategy with that of other major industrial countries or unions?
I mean, it's a good question, and it's a very difficult decision, actually. And why it's a difficult decision is because you're always going to have some misalignment between the growth opportunities for the sector, for the industrial sector within the UK, the optimal use of hydrogen domestically within the UK, and also where the UK has industrial and academic comparative advantages compared to competitors. So if you're very much focused on meeting UK low carbon energy needs, then you would take more of a UK focus, and what happens internationally matters a little bit less. If you're focused more on the growth side rather than the clean side of clean growth, if you're focused more on the growth side, then you need to worry a bit more about where the market is internationally and how you might enter that market, and you might want to encourage technologies that might not be ideal for the UK in the short term or even the medium term, but are a real opportunity for UK industry to export abroad. So it's difficult. So it's really hard. It depends what your goals are, and I'm still not quite clear. Although I know there's a base hydrogen strategy coming, I'm not quite clear exactly to what extent it's going to go towards the clean side or the growth side, and that will really determine how best you should design your strategy.
Those questions, and as you said, that your full report's available for download. So now we go on to the panel discussion. So we're fortunate to have another 3 esteemed panelists who will answer all of our questions, no doubt. So we have Frank Woods, Peter O'Sullivan, and Chris Manson-Whitten. So Chris Manson-Whitten is from Progressive Energy, Peter O'Sullivan from Penspen, and Frank from Worley. So perhaps, Chris, perhaps if you could start off, just a very brief introduction to yourself, and then we'll go on to Peter and then Frank. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, as you say, I'm a director at a company called Progressive Energy, and we have been pursuing hydrogen as well as carbon capture and storage since 1998. And our focus is, I guess, the 2 key projects that we're involved in this sector is HyNet, which is the Northwest hydrogen cluster that involves CCS that we are developing alongside a number of partners, including Cadent. and also the High Deploy project, which we're running at Keele University, and will also be running up in the northeast as well, which is blended. At Keele, we are currently blending hydrogen into the university gas grid as we speak.
Great, thanks, Chris. Peter?
Hi there. My name is Peter O'Sullivan. I'm the CEO. PenSpen is an international engineering consultancy. We've been around for about 65 years or so. Our focus really for a lot of our history has been on midstream infrastructure, particularly relating to gas distribution and utilization. And we're more and more getting into the area of hydrogen and carbon capture as it becomes obviously more important in the energy transition. And particularly in the UK and Europe, where we see a lot of interest and, more importantly, a lot of investment to help to move the energy sector in that direction.
Okay, Frank?
Yes, my name is Frank Wouters. I've been doing energy transition for, I guess, almost 30 years now. A large part of that was renewable energy, but recently, got the hydrogen bug, if you will, and I'm firmly convinced it's going to be the next big wave in the energy transition. And together with our clients, Morley, more than 50,000 people in many countries, and trying to understand what hydrogen can do in the energy transition for all of our clients.
Great, thank you. So all our panelists all represent three companies. They're obviously very closely interested in what the long-term scenario for hydrogen investments and infrastructure is. So hence the panel discussion here is a discussion about long-term mechanisms to support this investment and how our panelists feel that could best be done. So I'll just kick off with a couple of questions whilst waiting for some more questions from the floor. So first question is, what government policy and mechanisms would most be welcomed to facilitate private sector investment in the hydrogen economy? What's your feeling on this, Chris?
Okay, go on. I'm happy to chip in because I am currently, as part of HyNet, developing a 350 megawatt hydrogen production plant using natural gas. So that will be using the Johnson Matthey technology to convert that natural gas into hydrogen and then dispatch the CO2 for storage in the CCS infrastructure. So I would say we clearly need both demand and production of hydrogen. But I would say it is the production that needs to take that step forward first. There are lots of users, large industrial users we've been working with and others who have the potential to take that hydrogen. But until we have hydrogen produced at volume, we're not going to be able to actually unlock the market. And I would put forward that something akin to the contracts for difference, which is what is currently supporting our very successful offshore wind build out, would be ideally suited to provide a government-backed contract for the producers of hydrogen to have the confidence to build their facilities and to bring private investment to do that, which would then get large, low-carbon hydrogen, and would also suit smaller, electrolysis type projects too, would provide the basis for the production of the hydrogen. And that policy could be meshed with demand-side incentives as well, which could work well together. And I'm happy to talk about that a bit more, but let's let others chip in.
Great. So, Peter, would you chip in?
Yeah, sure, happy to. And I think just what Chris said there, absolutely right. I mean, let's be clear about what we're trying to do here is create a value chain and a marketplace for hydrogen, which haven't been done before necessarily, and so that some of it is about phasing the buildup of supply and demand and aligning that. I think in the UK, what seems to be going very well at the moment is building the supply and demand around industrial clusters to broaden that out, to make it applicable to say industrial heating, residential heating, transportation. I think you're going to need the types of mechanisms that Chris alluded to, contracts for difference, potentially capacity payments to ensure that when supply is built, it'll have a market. but also the bit in the middle, the infrastructure to get it to market needs a fairly substantial investment to make it all work. And so things like the Rio 2 negotiations that are currently under discussion, the outcome of that, I think, would be critical in incentivizing investment in the sort of infrastructure that will get hydrogen to its various end markets. And the role that Ofgem are going to play in the sector in determining investment in the infrastructure, clarity on that will be key, and understanding how they integrate the other parts of the government base, which has its own perspective on this, and how that's integrated with Ofgem, I think, is really key. So we're watching that space very closely and keen to see what the outcome is there.
Okay, and Frank Wouters, what's your feeling?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably mixed in the sense that it really depends on where you're from. And if we're looking, for example, at Japan, who has declared the desire to use hydrogen, but don't have the ability to produce much because of the limited land and ability to produce it in a carbon neutral way. So they'll be importing it, and they're talking to other countries to produce it for them. And then at home, they're stimulating the demand through price on carbon and inclusion of hydrogen products in a list of options to do that. But if we're looking at the biggest short-term market, that's definitely Europe. And we've seen, of course, the hydrogen strategy that was released on the 8th of July, massively ambitious, immediate target of 6 gigawatts of electrolysis capacity by 2024. And then that goes up to 2 times 40 gigawatts by 2030, 10 million tons, 1 million ton in 2024. And if you're looking at what you need to do, what you need to have in place in terms of regulatory regime, in terms of monetary support, all of that, to have 6 gigawatts online in 2024, you have to think outside the box, and that's part of the rationale behind the the European Hydrogen Alliance, which is a public-private partnership that will be able to find those fast-track courses of action that you need to have this kind of volume, which is so much more than what we're seeing right now. So you'll need to be creative. You'll need to do something, outside of the normal way of doing it if that's your immediate target. And the longer run, Chris already mentioned, you have to look at the supply side, but also at the demand side. And I think the third piece in the middle, infrastructure, all of those require different types of policy frameworks to make that happen. One of the thoughts that the UK has been doing for offshore wind, but that's also now on the table for hydrogen, would be the carbon contracts for difference. We know that green hydrogen, but also blue, is more expensive still than gray hydrogen. The price of carbon doesn't get you there, so the gap could be filled by a carbon contract for difference, which you can issue through auctions, which is what people are thinking about. At the same time, the question is, how are you then going to spread out the cost difference? And the traditional way would be to provide a subsidy and get the money for the subsidy through taxes. What we've seen in the past is that this kind of tax and spend policy is always volatile. You're competing with other demands for public money, schools, education, you name it. So one of the ideas that is worth considering would be to socialize the cost gap. So you take the carbon contracts for difference pot of money that is between what you pay in the market now for natural gas, and you'll have to pay for a while to fill the cost gap between green hydrogen and what you have as an alternative, and then spread it out over all the gas customers. So you basically increase the gas price a little bit with that cost difference over all the gas customers, and in that such a system, it wouldn't rely on politics. It wouldn't rely on tax money. And that could be based on the very successful, in my view, the German feed-in tariff, the Renewable Energy Act, that was a similar system, has proven to be very, very politically robust. Different colors of government didn't change it because it didn't cost them money.
Thanks for that, Frank. So we have from the floor a specific question for Chris, following on from your opening comments, as to whether you could elaborate more on the demand side incentives that you had in mind, and also your specific opinion on CFDs and the appetite for those. I mean, obviously it was mentioned within the EU's hydrogen strategy. What your feeling is in government in the UK on the appetite for CFDs? Obviously, it's been quite successful with renewables to date. As to whether you think that can be sort of applied wholesale, you know, across the board to hydrogen, or are there specific things about hydrogen that means that the CFD mechanism would have to work in a somewhat different way?
Okay, fantastic. I'm happy to pick up both of those. So, yeah, as I say, my belief is that where it really starts is a good structure to support the production of hydrogen. So we'll come back to that in a minute. The question then was about demand side incentives. So, for example, it would be possible to, you know, with, for example, blending into the grid, to insist that there is an obligation on suppliers, shippers, that a certain proportion of the gas that they distribute is low carbon gas, whether that's biomethane or whether it is hydrogen. And I think in general in the UK, our approach towards heat is much less developed than our approach towards electricity. So there's some catching up. And at which point those kind of systems would create a value, because there'd be a shortage, a value for the hydrogen and increase the value of the commodity. Now, the joy of using a contract for difference as a model means that the underlying commodity can change in value over time. So if you have a separate structure that supports the production of hydrogen with a certain level of subsidy on it, as the value of the underlying commodity increases, either because the underlying value increases or there are other policy mechanisms that drives that value, then that reduces the subsidy that needs to be paid at the point of production, but still maintaining that bankable, financeable structure of a constant contract for the producer. Now, there is a subtlety here. There is discussion here about carbon contracts for difference. I'm talking about hydrogen contracts for difference. One of the issues in the UK is that different users are exposed to different levels of carbon. So, for example, currently the gas user, domestic gas consumers are not exposed to any carbon price, whereas industrials are. So, interestingly, in the CCS, carbon capture and storage world, they are very much looking at using carbon contracts for different models, carbon contracts for difference to support CCS for industrials. But for hydrogen, there are numerous benefits of the vector. Yes, predominantly carbon, but there are other benefits. And so actually the thinking is to take the same model as for electricity, so for our offshore wind, and we have an offshore, we have an electricity carbon contract, electricity contract for difference. And the thinking here is to have a hydrogen contract for difference. You are right, there are some differences. The biggest difference being it is a new vector and a new market. So there are going to be levels of protection for the producer that are going to need to be necessary because there are relatively few users. What happens if a user falls away? There will need to be some protections in the first instance. And then going to Frank's point, that could be funded either through taxpayers or, and as we use for our offshore wind, as you refer to in Germany, it's actually a socialized cost across users. And we said to government, you could use either of those mechanisms, taxpayers or gas consumers, depending on where they think the biggest benefit is going to lie, particularly in the early years.
Thanks very much for that, Chris. Do you have any further sort of elaboration on those points, Peter or Frank, or a difference, a disagreement?
Yeah, just a couple of wrinkles, I guess. I mean, it's obviously, there's a lot, it's a complex scenario and a lot to consider. I think contracts for difference have clearly worked, and it's we can learn a lot from the power sector in terms of how they've incorporated and successfully developed renewable power. I think there's a couple of differences in hydrogen that need to be factored in. First of all, in terms of the hydrogen supplier or the hydrogen producer, I guess we need to see in terms of how the supply chain evolves, whether the SMR owner is actually the person who also owns the gas, or if the gas producer just supplies the SMR infrastructure owner, and that may have an effect on how you structure the contract for difference. The other thing is thinking down the other end of the value chain in terms of the demand profile. We're talking about multiple applications, use in industry for industrial heat, use in residential and commercial heating, use in transportation, and they have different demand volatilities and demand profiles. And typically the contract for difference is very effective where the demand profile is more volatile. So if you have a more predictable demand side profile, it may not be as necessary. But certainly for the more volatile sectors, I think it'll be enable investors to come into the market knowing that there's a certain level of return that they'll be able to recover from their investment.
Yeah, Peter, thanks. One of the other things to consider is that we can actually learn from the past. So it's not just what I mentioned, the German Renewable Energy Act, but also the introduction of natural gas into Europe. I mean, when the Groningen gas field was discovered, I think it was ExxonMobil that suggested we should export this, and then the connection with Germany was made, Belgium and France, and then the question is the original pricing system was cost plus because it was all domestically produced and you sell it to your fellow countrymen. But when you go across the borders, you're also replacing other fuels. So the thinking then was, how are we going to convince a German customer to switch from burning whatever fuel or coal to natural gas? So that became then the new pricing model. It was basically the price of the commodity that you're replacing with something a little bit more convenient and cleaner, perhaps. And so you have different prices because you are basically basing your price on the value to the customer. And I think a similar approach we need to find when we're entering, the bigger game for hydrogen, when you have a backbone that's publicly accessible and people are producing bulk hydrogen and that goes into a system. Obviously, if we're feeding a steel factory that is replacing coking coal, that's a different value proposition than if we're using it for heating, or if we're using it for to make ammonia, or back to power, or for storage. So I think the pricing, until we're completely basically standalone competitive and we don't need subsidies anymore, I think you're going to have to look at what you're competing with, what your value proposition is right now, and then again, the cost difference could become a carbon contract for difference, and we could socialize that or pay it through tax and spend. I'm personally convinced that socializing it is just a lot more robust and is more politically resilient. But yeah, those are some of the thoughts that we need to think through, and this can go very fast. I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, we're Europe, 10 million tons in 2030, backbone activities immediately. So all of that you need to start thinking about right now. And if I look at the European hydrogen strategy, is very rich in ambition, but not very rich in policy details. So all of this stuff we need to start working on right now.
Great, thanks, Frank. So thanks for Frank and Peter. Thanks for highlighting some of these other wrinkles and issues. Another question I think that this leads into is, obviously we've discussed a bit about the demand side incentives and CFDs. Do you think these are the only things that are needed to overcome challenges that stakeholders see in terms of putting investing their own money in these ventures, this infrastructure, etc.? Or is there something else we're missing, some other ingredient to the mix that's needed to incentivize stakeholders to fork out their own money? Because obviously, we're talking about significant sums of money up front, which will take a long time to pay back.
Well,
what do you think, Chris?
I guess I would say, the policy environment is key. So we have a hydrogen strategy due out in Q1 next year, and that will be key to give people the long-term view as to how serious this government is in committing to hydrogen. So we've seen in offshore wind things like sector deals, which not only have the mechanism like the CFD, but they also have an aspiration for a certain number of gigawatts of installed capacity. And I think policy confidence is absolutely crucial. And as Frank and Peter have both said, we need things to move fast because this sector is moving fast. And then I think the other thing is we need to recognize that we just need to get on and do early projects. It is only by actually doing stuff do we really find out what the real wrinkles are. We're all speculating what the wrinkles might be. It is by doing projects and recognizing, getting on and doing, we will learn. The UK's view, or the Committee on Climate Change, talks around 270 terawatt hours of hydrogen by 2050. That is huge. We can afford to do some early projects that will never become stranded projects. They will always deliver value. They may not be, we might discover there are problems with getting to 270 and it turns out to be 200. Well, I don't really care, actually. Let's get on and get the first few terawatt hours out there. Learn how to make sure that the production is good and that it's bankable and financeable, make sure we can distribute it appropriately, and make sure different hydrogen users are able to invest in the use of that hydrogen and have the resilience. We've just got to get on and learn by doing is my biggest message, I think.
Okay. Peter, Frank, what do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great sentiment. We have to get on and do it. We have to learn as we go. And do it in a strategic way. Absolutely. We talked a bit earlier about price up strap on carbon pricing, so that incentivizes the kind of demand that we're looking for. But I guess the other area that we're familiar with is in order to get the hydrogen to the user. There's the infrastructure in the middle, and some of that stuff is a natural monopoly. You're only going to want one of them. You only want one transmission system. You probably only want one carbon capture and storage or sequestration system, or it needs to manage in a way that some regulation. How that's going to be handled, I think, is key. Investors need to have the confidence that the infrastructure will be there, so that when they produce, they can get their product to market, and that that then is also joined up with the downstream demand side and the upstream production side incentives. So really, overall, there's an overarching strategy and holistic view of the system that investors will need to be confident in to ensure that it supports the investment and also the end goal of decarbonizing.
Yeah, Peter, I think that's a good point, and I do think that infrastructure is key. I was on another panel this morning. I had the Portuguese deputy minister on my panel, and I remember 5 years ago I was in Portugal, and I spoke to his predecessor, who was pretty frustrated. He said, I have people that can build wind farms in here without subsidy. They don't want subsidy. They just want to be able to build it and be able to get rid of the electricity. And you have in the electricity system in Europe bottlenecks from A to Z, and we haven't been able to solve that. So you can't tap into the potential that the Iberian Peninsula has in the electricity field, because you can't get it. I mean, it's become a little bit better, but it's still not, a pan-European optimized system. So the question is, are we going to do a better job with hydrogen? My gut feeling says that it should be easier. I mean, if you're looking at typical transition countries, if you will, France is a good example. If Germany wants to buy cheap solar power from Spain, it has to go through France. And what's the benefit of France? I mean, they just have more overhead power lines. A pipe, first of all, they're a lot more powerful. 48-inch pipe has 15 gigawatts capacity. It's underground, 6 meters typically, and nobody sees it. You can do it without intrusion. So perhaps that is the advantage that the hydrogen has over electricity, where we're struggling. We've been struggling for a long time, and it hasn't been optimal. So the other thing is, obviously, we already have 200,000 kilometers of transmission a pipe network in Europe, and a multitude of that in the distribution system. There's a bunch of, I think, 13 transmission system operators that recently released a plan for a hydrogen backbone. I think it was 20,000 kilometers. So 10% of the current high pressure system can be done at relatively modest cost, and then you're connecting already areas and enable that that flow of energy from supply to demand. But yeah, I think infrastructure is key and can't wait. The leaked version of the European hydrogen strategy in June said we will do that after 2030. 1 month later, it's now until 2030. So I think Europe has also discovered that without infrastructure, everything will wait. So I think that's a good sign.
Right. So we've focused quite a lot on these incentives, thinking about specific countries. If we have a look at a more international perspective, for example, we've seen the recent announcement by Air Products regarding the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia, an enormous project, $5-8 billion they were talking about. So this is related to a question from the floor regarding transportation of hydrogen. So is it sort of comment on the pros and cons of locating hydrogen production? Should you locate it near the demand or near the source? Or, for example, if you're talking about Saudi Arabia, where you can basically produce renewable electricity way cheaper than you can in Europe, and green hydrogen way cheaper. So I guess the answer is it depends. But I'll pass across to Chris to give a more erudite explanation of it depends.
I'm not sure whether I can, but I think the thing is we are going to need elements of all of these things. If you think about natural gas, we source biomethane from a local farm and we use it. We take natural gas from the continental shelf and bring it out, and we transport LNG around the world. And I think ultimately we need to think that hydrogen will end up being a vector just like that. So we will source from local renewable sources using small-scale electrolysis, deliver what we want. We will be at national level scale facilities, potentially using natural gas and carbon capture and storage infrastructure, or very large electrolysis potentially in the future. And then you roll all the way to exactly what you're saying, that if we have solar farms across Africa that are capable of generating a lot of hydrogen, it is another vector. Unlike electricity, we have the ability to pipe it, but we can also ship it. So absolutely, ultimately the market will work out where things are best produced at lowest cost, and whatever mechanisms we put in place now must allow the natural market to work its way through as the subsidies fall away.
Right, Peter and Frank, anything to add to that?
I could say when we get to large-scale green hydrogen production, we have a lot of flexibility about, and as Chris says, the market will drive where it's produced. I think in terms of blue hydrogen, a big factor is access to carbon sequestration. That's a huge cost that you have to factor in terms of production of blue hydrogen, and the ability to minimize that cost is key. So I think in the early days, we'll be looking for blue hydrogen production close to places where we can sequester the carbon dioxide most cost effectively. And then over time, perhaps we'll evolve to a more flexible system as green hydrogen becomes more and more economic. But I think that's going to be a key driver in the short term.
Yeah, I think I'm somewhat in agreement with Chris in the sense that we'll probably see it all. I think it's a general rule, since transporting a gas is so much more cost efficient than transporting an electron. Ideally, you make the gas where the renewable electricity is, and then you transport the gas. Now, how do you transport the gas? If you have a pipe, that's obviously the cheapest solution. But if you don't, then you can do a number of things. You can liquefy hydrogen, make it into ammonia, methanol. You have liquid organic hydrogen carriers. And there, to be honest, yes, we see a lot of momentum around ammonia. That seems to be something that is gaining traction. But I was in Japan in January, had hydrogen meetings for a week, and I've seen the same presentation like a number of times, but depending on who was holding it with a different result. So this is hydrogen, this is ammonia, this is, and then if it was an ammonia person, then the end result was ammonia as the best vector. If it was a liquid hydrogen person, exactly the same presentation, liquid hydrogen and the liquid organic hydrogen can, because all of them, they have pros and cons, and in that sense, it really depends. I think one thing to consider is that if you're looking at the bulk of the demand, that will be for hydrogen. So in terms of, for example, blending hydrogen with natural gas, we'll do that for a while, but in the end, the demand is not going to be for a mixture of methane and hydrogen. Demand is going to be for pure hydrogen, whether it's in the steel industry, for transport, for even for feedstock. So I think in the end, we'll be able to focus more and more on how to get that cost efficiently.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Chris, Peter, and Frank on our panel for giving some insight from their perspective for these what sort of mechanisms are needed to encourage sort of the long-term investment in hydrogen, both mechanisms that the government could put in place as well as private investment. So we're just slightly over time on the panel, so I'd like to wrap the panel up now. I'm going to suggest that we take a 5-minute comfort break. We've all been sitting here for quite a long time, so it's much needed. So thanks very much again, Frank, Peter, and Chris, and we'll break now for 5 minutes, and then we'll join Laura Finney, who will give her presentation at approximately 3:10. So thank you, everyone. So welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed a short break. We're having some problems with the next scheduled speaker getting to the feed in to work properly. So what we'll do is we'll skip forward on the program, and we'll bring in Nigel Curson, who is online as we speak. So Nigel will be speaking on network challenges converting to hydrogen. So for those who weren't in the sessions earlier on, Nigel, if you could give a very brief introduction to yourself, and then we'll go into your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so this presentation is about the reuse of existing oil and gas infrastructure within the hydrogen economy. And obviously, the cost that we're about to experience as a nation is enormous. So anything that we can reuse is good news. Potentially, some of it's becoming redundant anyway. In terms of what there is, in terms of oil and gas infrastructure, onshore we've got a whole transmission system about 7,500 kilometers of transmission system, 250,000 kilometers of distribution, connected to 25 million customers. In fact, 85% of all UK homes are actually connected to the system. Then offshore, over 14,000 kilometers of oil and gas pipelines, going from through a few strategic locations out to a number of offshore platforms, some in shallow water, 20 meters, going up to 150 meters water depth plus. So, and a whole bunch of offshore platforms, some of which have already been decommissioned, some of which are about to be decommissioned. 400 or so, in fact, offshore platforms. So we heard in other previous sessions in the panel that the hydrogen transportation is an incredibly important thing, and that there are various ways of doing it. Certainly, compressing it and transporting it in cylinders is one way. That is actually being used in some parts of the world already as a supercooled liquid. as a truck or a ship, but it's very super cool, something like minus 200 and something degrees centigrade, or as ammonia, which we've just heard about in the last panel session. But really significant volumes, the most cost-effective way is by pipeline, really, and in most cases for large volumes, that's really what's being proposed. And there is a case for this already, a precedent case, because coal gas, which we used to use in the UK in the 1970s, was about 30% hydrogen, and 30 to 50% hydrogen. Also, there's at least 1,600 miles of hydrogen pipelines already currently operating in the United States, distributing to refineries that use hydrogen as a raw product. So, considering pipelines versus cables, obviously I'm biased here because one of Penspen's core businesses really is pipeline consultancy. Pipelines are something like 10 to 20 times cheaper than electricity by cable, because you're talking about steel versus copper. You're talking about pylons, step up, step down transformers, and also in terms of capacity, they're radically different. You're talking about 1 to 2 gigawatts for cables, and it can be as much as 50 gigawatts for hydrogen pipelines. And also they're underground. They're not so obvious, secure, buried. And in terms of losses, pipelines have very limited losses. Cables have I-squared R losses. So pipelines are also more flexible. You can up and down the pressure and actually use the pipeline itself as they call it line pack, to actually store energy, or you can store in underground salt caverns. So pipelines are very flexible in that sense. And storing hydrogen in your pipeline is about 100 times cheaper than it is in electricity in a battery. So a little bit about storage. I mean, storage is incredibly important for various reasons. I mean, obviously, if you're building SMR, ATR assets, then sweating those is very important. They need to be absolutely operating flat out. Also, the annual swing between summer and winter, and also being able to import hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is actually an excellent method of storage. You can turn it back into energy very quickly. It can be stored for very long periods of time, and in very large volumes compared with other techniques of storing energy. So storage of hydrogen in salt caverns, again, that's existing technology. We already have a number of salt caverns that are operated in the UK for natural gas, and we have an abundance of salt layers, Permian and Triassic, which can be easily converted into salt caverns for storage. In fact, we've got 100 salt cavern sites potentially. So again, the transmission network is incredibly important to transport hydrogen between the users and storage, and between the suppliers, production and storage. So, and the levelized cost of hydrogen storage is that it's much cheaper compared with vessels or cryogenics. So, cool. We talk about hydrogen transportation, but CO2 transportation is just as important, because we know that long-term future, green hydrogen by electrolysis is going to be very important for renewables. But really, the only practical way of getting a lot of hydrogen right now is by SMR or ATR. So that needs CO2 sequestration. So ideally, you would actually build your SMR or ATR close to where you can sequester it. So again, transportation of CO2. Again, it can be transported in a pipeline as a liquid or a gas, and ship as a supercooled liquid. But for reasonable distances, the ship is a lot more expensive. So really, again, pipelines are likely to be the main method. If you look at the phase equilibrium diagram of CO2, you can see the critical pressure is about 74 bar. But impurities, particularly when it's produced by SMR, drive this up. So a typical operating pressure of a pipeline is about 100 bar. Now onshore pipelines, typically maximum pressure is about 85 bar. So reuse of existing network infrastructure for CO2 transportation is not impossible, but more likely in the gas phase for more limited volumes. So you're transporting it as a dense phase liquid. The pressure is likely to be too high. But a lot of the offshore pipelines that come into the UK are operating at pressures above that. So certainly very, very feasible. Typically CO2 is captured at a pretty low pressure. So significant multi-stage pressure is required, which produces a lot of it, needs a lot of energy. And also at the other end, you've got to get it back down if you're getting CO2 into an existing oil and gas reservoir, then that could be quite a low pressure, 10 bar, 20 bar, for example. So you need to actually get a lot of energy back into the CO2 to enable you to expand it back down to that pressure. So to avoid very low temperatures. So doing all this makes sequestration very expensive. 39 to 54% added to the cost of electricity, and 17 to 44% on the cost of SMR. So anything you can do to make that cheaper, is very enabling. Certainly repurposing offshore pipelines, minimizing distance, and repurposing platforms and reservoirs are very, very important. In terms of storage sites, again, the UK is very well endowed with CO2 sites, something like 78 gigatons over 500 sites. It's actually the largest in Europe. And taking account of total UK emissions, we've got something like 200 years worth. Almost certainly before you get to that point, then electrolysis would have taken over, and the need for sequestration would be less. But saline aquifers are actually the largest. People think of it as being oil and gas reservoirs being the largest, but saline aquifers are actually larger. So initial repurposing of former oil and gas reservoirs is very important for CO2 sequestration. So some of the challenges, particularly with respect to hydrogen, thinking about compression. Obviously, you need to compress hydrogen to transport it through a pipeline. So centrifugal compressors are the compressor of choice for natural gas, but reusing the current compressors is not so straightforward. The molecular weight of hydrogen is significantly different from natural gas. So the tip speed of the rotor needs to go about 3.8 times faster. And if you work out the centrifugal force in the rotor, it's about 14.4 times the stress will be generated. And also, hydrogen has a propensity to embrittle materials. It actually soaks into the material and changes the properties. And this demands that you have a pretty low operating temperature for compressors. Typically, natural gas compressors can go in between stages up to 150 degrees centigrade, but natural gas is more like 65 degrees centigrade. So really, an ideal hydrogen compressor is quite a bit different from a natural gas compressor. The alternatives or typical compressor used with hydrogen is a reciprocating piston. But these, for the kind of hydrogen transmission we're talking about, these would be extremely large. Some of the largest ones currently manufactured anywhere in the world. There are some other techniques. There is some work to be done on optimizing compression for hydrogen transportation. So, also challenges in quality and blending. Currently, again, this has popped up a few times in the conversation. The GSM MR government regulations have a maximum and minimal admissible level of hydrogen of about 0.1%. Clearly we're talking about blending up to 20%. So this will require right now we need special permission from the Health and Safety Executive to actually use more than 0.1%. So, but you'll see in Europe, the graph on the right, that already quite a lot of European countries allow a lot more hydrogen. So. Another significant difference between hydrogen and natural gas is the calorific value. The calorific value of hydrogen is something like a third of natural gas by volume. It's a lot higher by mass, but by volume it's only about a third. So in terms of the multiplier for the same energy, you need about 16% more in terms of volume for 20% hydrogen, and about 3.39 times more in terms of volume for 100% hydrogen. So this is effectively meaning your velocity in your pipeline needs to be about 3.39 times more to get the same energy. Hydrogen actually has less frictional losses, so there are other positives. Or likewise, about three times the pressure to get the same energy density. So some of the new hydrogen pipelines being proposed are very high pressure, much higher than there's been experienced in UK gas networks, 200 bars, for example. In the existing network, there are also velocity limitations to avoid excessive pressure drop, but also to avoid picking up dust, because dust can damage downstream equipment. So historically, these pressure limitations or velocity limitations have been applied. There's been a lot of studies have been done, H21, H100, for example, and some reinforcement of the local distribution networks is required to take account of these high velocities requirements. Excuse me. Also, there is some flexibility. Currently, there's a benefit in operating local distribution zones at a lower pressure, so that they can minimize losses. So governors are set to reduce leaks, so they can actually be operated higher. So there are some kind of workarounds to increase capacity. So there's a challenge for materials. As I said before, there's about 1,600 miles of carbon steel pipelines currently being used in the US for transporting hydrogen. Some operating up to 140 bar, but the high strength steels are very susceptible to hydrogen embrittlement and a reduction in properties. So really, the proven steel grades are X42, which is relatively a low strength steel compared with modern steel grades that are used. So and you'll find that these existing pipelines are all pretty small diameters, relatively 12 inches, for example, whereas our transmission pipelines typically in the UK are 36 inches, that kind of side. So, and also operating is at very low stresses. So we can end up with some very, very thick wall pipelines. There is some work being done on using carbon reinforced materials for hydrogen as well, to get around some of these hydrogen embrittlement issues. Also, the challenge is dealing with the mix, and it's relatively easy to see how 5 to 10% hydrogen can be added, because it has minimal impact on many things, or even 20% hydrogen. But really, to solve our climate goals, we need to go to 100% hydrogen. So we're going to end up potentially with a need for dual pipelines. If we think about transferring cities over to 100% hydrogen, you're going to have to supply them with hydrogen pipelines and natural gas pipelines, so that you can progressively switch section by section. There is some technology around about deblending, actually taking 100% hydrogen out of blended hydrogen, which could be used for supplying 100% hydrogen users. So, and also how to bill. Currently gas has quite a specific calorific value, so it's very easy to bill consumers, because you can just do it on a weighted just based on the volume. But in the future, then it's quite likely that users are going to have different calorific values arriving on their property. So we need potentially different techniques to actually bill individuals. And there's various different ways that's actually being proposed. The other challenge is leakage. You're probably aware hydrogen is a much smaller molecular species It tends to permeate through materials. It will permeate through HDPE pipelines. It'll permeate much more easily through flange connections. It'll permeate through packing in valves. So as much work is being done on this right now about figuring out tolerable limits or more efficient packing. Generally speaking, it's got something times seven times the leak rate of natural gas. So also it has a marked difference in the risk assessment as well. In terms of pipeline infrastructure, and hydrogen is very, very buoyant, so it tends to go up into the atmosphere very quickly. So you find that the radius, typically we analyze risks associated with pipelines using a QRA, or quantitative risk assessment technique. This considers the probability of a leak occurring, which is based on statistical data, and then the consequences of that leak. In other words, the distance it'll reach to an ignition source. But actually going through that assessment and comparing hydrogen to natural gas, then the proximity distance is much less for hydrogen because it's so much more buoyant. But the actual impact due to the ignition is greater. So I'm not saying there's a higher risk for hydrogen. It's just different, and I know that's under a lot of research right now. And of course, we're talking about here about risk from pipelines, but obviously there's risk to plants, obviously within dwellings again, which has different different drivers. So another issues, with 100% hydrogen, there are quite a lot of other issues. There's a much more lower tolerance of defects in castings. Small defects close to the surface can actually be sites for collection of hydrogen, which can cause fractures and blisters. Valves require positive sealing of glands. Compression fittings are highly recommended, really. So the degree of the welding will be a lot higher. So also, currently leakage surveys are carried out with natural gas, but we expect leakage surveys to be something like 4 times the volume or the frequency as they currently are with natural gas. So, but in general terms, if you think about non-metallic materials, ISO 111142 talks about transportation gas cylinders, equally valid for any kind of material in close proximity to hydrogen, but it's pretty much acceptable with most current materials that are used, but there is an issue with permeability. You see there polypropylene under plastic materials. Hydrogen will permeate through it, but it doesn't actually affect its properties. So summary in terms of the challenges, this is some work that was done by Marco Gas, and they looked at the whole range of issues related to use of natural gas. You see the vertical scale here goes between 0 and 99 or 100%. Along the bottom are all the issues with transmission, gas storage. And a few here I've highlighted. Pretty much from 0 to 100%. Sealing of pig traps is an issue. We already talked about compressors on the left there. Compressors only work up to about 5%. Beyond that, there's an issue. Well completions typically are made of screwed connections, and they make use of high strength materials. So again, very, very susceptible to hydrogen embrittlement. So again, replacement of well materials. Ultrasonic meters will work to a certain extent, but not beyond 10%. Fittings again, need some work. And obviously, boilers within domestic dwellings as well. We know they'll work up to about 10%, possibly even 20%. But beyond that, you need new infrastructure. So quite a bit of good work already. We already have quite a few codes and standards. ASME B31.12. We've got the European Industrial Gas Association, Compressed Gas Association have produced standards. So there is guidance, which is good news. So just wanted now to talk about a few examples of projects, where reuse is a key issue. One here, which I think is very, very important for the future, is the Dolphin Project, which is about floating wind. And the objective here is to produce hydrogen. There are a number of different routes. So certainly, one of them is to actually have desal offshore and then transport hydrogen by pipeline, which gives great opportunities to reuse pipelines, of course. The industrial clusters, pretty much all the industrial clusters are planning on using existing oil and gas infrastructure for carbon capture and storage. The exceptions is the South Wales cluster, which is planning on using ships to transport hydrogen, but then it's going to transport it potentially to Acorn, where again it'll use existing oil and gas infrastructure to sequester CO2. Of course, we just talked about the Acorn project, so I think I'll skip that one. Northwest cluster, HyNet, again is using the existing oil and gas infrastructure in the Liverpool Bay, and but there are some new CO2 pipelines planned to transport it to the point where it can be sent offshore. And H21 really is a very important Leeds Citygate project. We're planning on turning over the whole of Leeds, and I think they've gone on to look at the whole of the north of England, with Leeds, Bradford, and Wakefield. This requires 4 SMRs on the coast, integrated carbon capture, integrated salt cavern storage and Teesside, and a new hydrogen transmission pipeline. You can see on the right there. And the idea is to slowly swap people over from blended gas or natural gas to 100% hydrogen. A lot of work's been done on that really. So that's reusing the whole existing distribution system. And the same really with H100 as well. That's a very, very similar concept, but mainly based on green hydrogen in the Fife area. So in terms of, in summary, I mean, pipelines are really the lowest form of transportation. Our networks have a very, very key role in decarbonisation. You know, our existing infrastructure will be very important for supplying domestic customers for hydrogen, CO2 and transmission, to or from storage, to sequestration, for importing renewables from offshore wind. We just talked about the Dolphin project, and also security balancing of supply. You know, with all these industrial clusters, then transporting hydrogen around, you know, it's going to be very important for security of supply. So, and obviously energy storage, line pack, and access to storage sites. So the requirements of the network will change, and some elements will need to be replaced. But you know, but a lot of it can be reused. And of course, most offshore platforms will have to go through abandonment. I think that's for sure. But some, I think, can be reused for transformer stations or for electrolysis points, and also, you know, hydrogen transportation via interconnecting pipelines back to the coast. And the Netherlands, I know, is with Neptune Energy are actually planning on doing the same thing. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. I'll hand back to Peter for any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Nigel. I think you've introduced quite a lot of information that a lot of us would not have been aware of, so that's been very useful. So we have a question from the floor, which segues off your last comment there about platforms. So the participant is interested to know how much of offshore platforms would you see being able to be used for a range of applications, such as decentralized production and storage. So, you know, thus avoiding transportation for bunkering of ships or exportation. So what sort of pros and cons do you see for reusing offshore platforms for these purposes?
I think the whole offshore infrastructure is potentially very, very important, because getting offshore wind, to actually produce all the electrical cables we need to get out to offshore wind, because we know to get to our eventual targets, that's very important for us. a lot of infrastructure has been required, electrical infrastructure, to actually think about that in terms of pipelines. I think potentially, a lot of those offshore platforms could become collection points for electrical power, and and then electrolysis, and then transporting that back into the gas network. The deeper water platforms, again, with Dolphin, you've got floating infrastructure. They could be used for transformer and electrolysis sites. So I think it's definitely not going to be 100%. It probably will end up being a small proportion, but certainly they have value. So.
Okay, we have another question regarding compression. So do you feel that the compression issues you mentioned particularly favour local production and use, or it's just simply a case that compression is just one element in the whole pipeline, and there's pros and cons depending on what's in the pipeline and the local use distance from source to use, etc.
So
well, it was particularly regarding whether you see the compression issues that you outlined earlier, whether they are so dominant that it would really favour just local production and use, or whether these are just one issue amongst a range of issues which need to be resolved.
Yeah, one issue amongst a range of issues. I mean, bulk transportation of hydrogen is a necessary function. I don't think issues with compression are not going to drive it to local use. There's already a lot of research been done on compression, and there is already existing compression technology which could be used for scale, but we'd have to obviously use it to a scale it hasn't been done before. But no, I think that's just one of a multitude of issues that need to be resolved, and it's already kind of in hand. There's already quite a bit of research on the ideal bulk hydrogen compressor, and some of the centrifugal compressor manufacturers are already working on solutions. So
okay, well, that's encouraging to hear. So thank you very much, Nigel, for your presentation, and we'll move on to the next speaker. Our next speaker was due to be Laura Finney from the EPSRC. She was going to speak on research and funding activities in hydrogen. Unfortunately, Laura has had some IT issues and can't join us. So we'll now be joined by the final speaker, Derek Alexander Wilson from Zero Carbon Consultants, and he will be speaking on transitioning to a green hydrogen economy. So I'd like to hand over to Derek now. So if you can give us a brief introduction to yourself and then go into your presentation. Thank you, Derek.
Okay, I'll just tell you what my slide says. Transition to a green hydrogen economy without compromising lifestyles or choices. And I think that phrase is pretty key because we've seen as a species, even when we know there are great looming alarming problems facing us, we're very reluctant to compromise and get out of our cars and do all the things we know we should do, whether it's eating less meat, etc. So what I've tried to focus on is coming up with a series of systems from technology, things we can actually build today. And that's another point I would stress. We're now out of time, which we'll come to in the next slide. We really need to focus on things we can build tomorrow, that the R&D phase where we can no longer say, oh yeah, trust us guys, we can continue with this process of fossil fuel driven X, Y, or Z, and very soon we'll be able to solve it with, for example, carbon capture and storage. I don't want to tread in any toes here, but I'm looking for, and if someone can send me information on actual examples of cement factories that are profitably implementing carbon capture and storage, wow, I haven't found them yet, but I'd love to hear about them. Not ones that will be coming on in 5 years, because we need to act today. So that's kind of slide one. We're in a very urgent situation. We have the solutions, and that's the other thing I would say. On the graph, I'm going to take you down a roller coaster of, oh my God, I didn't have any idea it was that bad, and then bring you back up with, hey, it's okay, we actually have real world solutions, not airy-fairy promises down the road. So if I click to the next slide, which I can see and you can't, here we go. This slide is about how do you and I tell everybody in the elevator pitch exactly what's happening with global warming, why it's happening, and the scale of it, and put it across in a way which instantly puts a picture in your mind. But that's my goal with this chat. I would like every single viewer to have one clear picture in their mind after all the speakers are done, that they will never forget and will be of use in every conversation they have every day from now on. And if I've done my job right, this is it. 75 years ago, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs released enough energy to melt sand and rock and turn it to glass. And we've all seen graphic images of what nuclear bombs do. How does that link to global warming? Today, the Earth's carbon duvet, carbon dioxide global warming, it's just a warm blanket around the planet that's slowly cooking us. The Earth's carbon duvet today is 415 parts per million thick, and it's actually rising by 2.5 parts per million per year. Now, for geological time, for the time that mammals have evolved our bodies and ecosystems on this planet, we've basically had an average of 235 parts per million pre-industrial for all geological time, and then just in the last 100 years, as opposed to the last X millions of years, we've added 180 parts per million. We've thrown a carbon blanket. We've thrown our own extra duvet around the planet. Now, guys, ladies and gentlemen, this extra carbon blanket is trapping the equivalent heat energy of 3 atomic bombs per second, 24/7, 365. And that's peer-reviewed science. That's, with all total respect, the wonderful charities. That isn't knit your own yogurt, Greenpeace fringe guy. This is science. That comes from Mark Linus, a Royal Society, a prize-winning Royal Society scientist and journalist who's written multiple books. And I'll give Mark a plug. I don't know if you can see this. Our Final Warning, 6 Degrees by Mark Linus. This book is full of peer-reviewed fact, similar to what I've just given you. And it leaves you in no doubt as to why we must act. Now, if you do a quick calculation in the lovely 2-3 hours cozy chat we've all been having, 180 nuclear bombs per minute times 60 minutes times 3 hours. Guys, that is what we're doing. That's what we have done with carbon. And that's why Cambridge University and a lot of other people, from Bill Gates and the super wealthy, have now funded DAC, direct air capture. Because, guys, I'm here to say, forget airy-fairy goals of 2050 carbon neutral by 2050. We need to be sucking in the carbon. We need to remove the blanket, guys. We've pumped out 180 parts per million extra carbon into the atmosphere in the blink of an eye, burning fossil fuels. We need to remove that to get back to zero and forget 2050, forget quotes of 20-meter sea life by the end of the century. There won't be any journalists debate that crazy statement. The recent science that is coming out, and every IPCC report, and all these wonderful scientists that are committing their life's work to this, every one of their worst case nightmare scenario predictions is now being exceeded. And these predictions were only made 5 years ago when they were doing their very best and coming up with 2050, 2080, end of century quotes. Now the Arctic is burning and forests are vanishing. The biodiversity has collapsed and is into the abyss. So I told you I was going to take you down the slide. Well, you're there. That is reality. Okay, next slide. How can we counter that? That's the bad news. 3 atomic bombs per second worth of heat energy going into the oceans every second. Wow, from the carbon we have burned. Here's the antidote. We can rebalance the energy equation. Here's why. Every 6 hours, enough solar energy hits the deserts of the world to provide 100% of humanity's energy needs for a year. Every 6 hours. So if we all got together and covered the deserts of the world in 100% solar panels, switch on the power station, boys, 10 o'clock in the morning, 6 hours later, switch off. See you next year, guys. We've just provided enough energy for humanity for a year. And as Richard Branson said, there is only one game in town. How do we capture and store that energy? There's more factors coming in that, but that's the bottom line. And if you look at the planet and space, the solar energy hitting it, we've got three real sources we talk about, but basically it's all just solar energy hitting the planet, because every piece of wind power is only driven by the solar energy that comes from space and hits the planet. Wind doesn't just self-generate. Wind is just a side effect from solar energy, heating and cooling and the climate. It's all just part of it. You take away the solar energy, the wind disappears. We'd still have volcanic, the core of the earth still releases energy, but that's a separate story. But the main point here is every 6 hours enough solar energy hits the deserts of the world to provide 100% of humanity's energy needs for a year. Scale that back in the real world, use solar panels of real world efficiency, or even better, use concentrated solar panels. Don't have time to go into the geopolitical aspect of this, but how about giving every country, especially where there's resource wars, poverty, food shortages, wind shortages, imagine giving them the technology that they don't need to import silicone and solar panel from America or China or high-tech Western factories. Imagine every country having simple 100-year-old technology. We've all burned paper with a magnifying glass. Focus the sun's rays, boil a liquid, generate steam, bolt on a 100-year-old steam turbine, voila! You have electricity that's too cheap to meter. Again, this is all on the website, but I've posted multiple examples of real-world power stations that are now generating off-the-scale low-cost energy. Land-based CSP solar and land-based wind will become too cheap to meter, which is why a lot of vested interests are countering it. But again, that's another story. But when you take that core fact, that undeniable piece of we can build it today and solve this problem, how do we store the energy? Lovely answers that, but basically hydrogen, and it's the two sides of the hydrogen coin, ammonia and hydrogen. With ammonia and hydrogen, you can solve the energy storage and energy transport situation. I'm sure there's been other speakers talking about fuel cells and the technology, the massive increase in efficiency. And just before I go to the next slide, efficiency. I'd like to destroy a couple of myths here. Energy efficiency is last century's buzzword. Why? Oh, you're Derek. Whoa. You're talking about wasting energy. No, I'm not. I'm saying every 6 hours, enough solar energy hits the deserts of the world to provide 100% of humanity's energy for a year. We don't need to obsess about, oh my God, it's not as efficient as X, Y, or Z, fossil fuel based, or toxic time bomb, i.e. 500 kilos of lithium ion battery that has poisoned the planet and destroyed lives in the mining process, is charged by primarily fossil fuels globally, and then has an end-of-life disposal issue that is unknown. It's so horrific. If that stuff leaks into the water table en masse, it will make the PCBs and plastic pollution in the ocean look like a kid's tea party. So, you know, there's a myth right there. On my website, there is a peer-reviewed 32-page report from a Swedish university detailing the entire process of a lithium-ion car, lithium-ion battery in a car versus petrol versus diesel versus a hybrid. I think from off the top of my memory, in 42 states in America where they tested this, every single one of the 42, the Tesla produced more carbon and more pollution wheel to wheel. So, you know, we all love to drive our electric cars and think we're doing the right thing. We all thought biodiesel was the answer, and then they started clear-cutting pristine forests to plant rapeseed oil monoculture, destroying biodiversity and water table and livelihoods to sell the rich Western guys like us biodiesel, so as we could jug around in 20% biodiesel and feel good we're being green. There are so many things that we've gone down the wrong path. I would urge everybody, when you Google what's green, what's good, don't Google it, Google scholar it. Add that one word scholar, pick any subject, pick your favorite subject and Google it. Take the homepage, there's your Google homepage. There's the facts, ladies and gentlemen. No, Google scholar, not one of the links on your Google page will be peer-reviewed science. Like, only Google scholar. Don't believe the well-meaning journalist, don't believe your guy down the pub, don't believe your super smart doctor who's a heart surgeon, he's a genius, but he's not an atmospheric scientist. Only fill your mind with peer-reviewed science from the appropriate experts. That's a huge point. Again, Branson said that. I'll move quickly on to the next slide. A little bit of light-hearted stuff. Well, it's not really light-hearted, it's a crazy question. Why do grizzly bears not chase mice? Serious question, think about it. Why do grizzly bears not chase mice? The answer is a 600-kilo grizzly bear will burn way more energy standing up and running 10 meters to swat the mouse than it ever gets from that mouse. And every species from bacteria and viruses that are plaguing us today, to blue whales and elephants and grizzly bears, they are subject to the fundamental laws of physics and laws of nature. All energy is only conserved. Energy can never be destroyed. It can only be converted. So if you burn more energy in your hunter-gatherer activities than you get from the food, your species is going extinct. Why do I say that? How does it impact our lives? Here is a classic statement. 99% of all human activity is unsustainable. 99% of human activity is unsustainable. Example, from our daily shopping trips to space exploration. A typical fossil fuel family car consumes approximately 9 million calories, brackets, 1 litre of diesel contains 9.2 million calories, on a short trip. And the average calorific value of your bags of shopping, if you bring back 3 or 4 big bags, that's 10,000 calories. So wait a minute, we've just burned 9 million in a litre of diesel. Now, if you've walked or cycled, totally different story. But think of the billions, not even millions, who do that regularly. You hunt or gather, burning 9 million, you bring back 10,000. This is all detailed a bit more accurately in the website, but we're burning approximately 900 times more energy hunting gathering than we are gaining from the food. And that's before, I update this in the website, but that's before road miles or air miles. You know, in this country, we used to eat lots of apples flown in from New Zealand. You fly in an apple, I mean, unless it was unobtainium, you know, size of an apple, but you had a huge energy density, then you could justify it. Like if you ship around coal or oil or fossil fuels, you can actually justify you're moving dense energy, you're spending a little bit and you're moving it from place to place. But food and the whole principle of recycling waste food, yeah, like it's going to be worthwhile to take a 10-ton truck fueled with high energy diesel, drive it around collecting cabbage leaves and grass cuttings, take back to a factory powered by fossil fuels, huge energy bill, to smash it all up, crush it into a bundle, stick it in a truck, and then drive that truck 40 miles to a green energy biodiesel plant. I worked there for 9 months to check this out. They had a 5 cubic meter diesel tank just to power their machines to scrape the thing. That was refueled every 3 days. The carbon footprint of reprocessing food waste in the biodiesel is insane, just like this. So it's another holy cow. You know, the only thing worse than fossil fuels is hydro. The Three Gorges Dam in China, far more environmentally destructive than fossil fuels. But we thought we were doing the right thing. Okay, last little one. I'm going to move on to the next slide, but here's another one from Mark Linus, another book. He wrote a previous book called The God Species. Here's a stat for you. Dam building in the north. I just talked about the Three Gorges Dam in China. We have artificially stored so much weight, that's such a huge amount of water with a massive weight in the northern hemisphere. We've effectively sucked it up by capturing rain and not allowing it to rebalance over the planet. We've stored so much water in the northern hemisphere, we have tilted the axis of our planet in space. That's why the book is called The God Species. We literally have godlike powers. We have affected this planet, of course, in a massively negative way, like a nightmare god, Loki, not Thor. And that's peer-reviewed science. One thing I love about Mark, he'll give you XYZ chapters. The last chapter of The God Species is line after line after line of referenced peer-reviewed science. He never gives his opinion. He only quotes other facts and says, put all these together, and this is the consequence. You make up your mind. But that's another example of crazy dam building when people call hydro renewable electricity and sustainable. Lovely question posted by Dr. Graham Cooley of ITM Power, UK's super fuel cell manufacturer. Molecules versus electrons. What do I mean by molecules versus electrons? 100 years ago, we came up with the idea of taking our veins out of our body and building little structures and putting all our veins so we have not just an exoskeleton, but an exo-vulnerable part. What do I mean by that? It's called, in today's terminology, the smart grid. 100 years ago, it was just called the national grid. But the principle of taking lightning in a bottle, electricity, which has never been stored and never will be stored. You cannot store electricity, you cannot store it, you can only convert it. Highly lossy process. So when the lightning in the bottle is generated in any form of power plant and transmitted at 186,000 miles per second, you either use it or lose it at the far end. Now, the whole principle of mining the steel and mining the copper cables or the alloy cables and the 40 tons of concrete to embed each pylon and covering the planet in this horrific structure, which is then vulnerable to wind and weather and waves and rust and metal fatigue and power outages that have plagued every nation on earth and is overloaded. And now we want to take away the trillions of joules of energy from all other sources of transport, i.e. fossil fuels, and try and charge our vehicles with that creaking old grid. Insane. What's the alternative? Molecules versus electrons? You take a ditch, you dig a ditch, you put in a plastic pipe made from fossil fuels. All fossil fuels aren't bad. We do need fossil fuels to make polyethylene pipes. Put a polyethylene pipe in the ground, put hydrogen through it. Diameter for diameter, you take even a small diameter hydrogen pipe, it has approximately 3 times more energy carrying capacity than a high-speed smart grid line. And the carbon footprint and the cost of building it, as you can imagine, if you were hired to build either, night and day, it's approximately a third to run the modern gas pipes that we need. And the UK already has a 50% success rate here. What do I mean by that? We've converted over half of all our gas pipe network to modern polyethylene, preparing for hydrogen. And then that will be finished in less than 10 years. We're on target, absolutely on target, to finish it by 2030. So the UK gas grid can take 100% hydrogen. Now, the beauty of hydrogen, many beauties of hydrogen, especially green hydrogen, it's an energy store as well as transport, as well as fuel. So, for example, I want to say, let's not spend any more money in the grid. If you have a housing development, we're planning a beautiful, unbelievable housing development, nature reserve, etc. Now, we only need a plastic pipe to that. You want electricity, just like we've got fridge freezers in the home, you should have a fuel cell in the home, just fridge freezer size, gas pipe in, water pipe in, and you're done. At the end of the day, if you've got hydrogen coming, a fuel cell can generate electricity. And to make electricity, obviously, water in, electricity in, you get hydrogen out, splitting the H off the H2O. And it begs the question, molecules versus electrons. Is it better to try and clean up a terrible, filthy industry, i.e. the fossil fuel industry, or is it better to put your time and effort and resource into an industry which doesn't need cleaning up? It needs more money spent on it because it doesn't exist right now. You have to effectively build a green hydrogen infrastructure where we're down at the tiny percentages of what we need. But as Prince Charles just said yesterday, this is in Reuters news today, I love this. I'm a big fan of Prince Charles. I hold my hands up, I'm biased. I love the guy. But he said yesterday, we need a Marshall Plan. What we did to recover from the Second World War, the Marshall Plan, which only quite recently has Britain finished paying the debt to America, ironically enough. That's the scale of this. It makes the COVID crisis and the debt look quite small. But we need to think in terms of percentages of GDP. What does your country spend on military? 2% of your GDP goes to military. Guys, we need to be looking at 2 to 5% of all countries' GDP poured into saving biodiversity and building the green hydrogen economy. Because every second, 3 nuclear bombs worth of heat is bubbling and frying our ocean. But we have no time to hope promises and trust anyone, be they governments, be they private industry, be they public sector, to R&D their way out. In a few years, we'll have the recycling. In a few years, we'll have the CCS, whatever. We need stuff. We need spades in the ground in 2021. We need to talk very honestly between now and Christmas and I've really posted a lot about this and written a lot about it. We need urgency. As Greta Thunberg and everybody else says, all the scientists will tell you, panic never does anyone any good, but we need focused excitement at very least on this problem. What can we do every second 3 nuclear bombs go off? What can we do to counter that? We need to get building in January 2021, not be waiting on 5-year annual reports. And God bless all these gifted scientists who are way smarter than me from the IPCC and the UN Millennium Assessment reports and a whole range of geniuses all pouring their hearts out to tell us the same thing every year for 20, 30, 40 years. We have solutions now. We need to grab them and build them in months, not years. And we need to build them on a percentage of GDP of the Western world and then assist the developing world. No other solutions will work. And don't let anyone convince you they can. That's the real science behind this. The scale of the problem requires that scale of solution. You won't tackle this monster in any conventional business sense. You can't, the power of the markets and entrepreneurs won't look at it. We need everything from education and media and government regulation. We need to do what it would take in a wartime effort. As Prince Charles says, we need a wartime mentality to implement a Marshall Plan. And we have the technology and the solutions. It is not too late. I wouldn't be wasting, if I genuinely didn't believe this was possible, I'd be chilling with my family and spending the rest of our lives together enjoying time. Because, if it ever comes to that point where we truly run out of time, I'll be the first to say, wow, let's just roll over and prepare for the worst. But we are not there. Don't let anyone depress you or think the problem's too big. The problem is immense. It's unimaginably huge, but it's not as big as our ability to solve it. And that's, along with the 3 bombs going off, 3 nuclear bombs, 3 Hiroshimas every second, that's the 2 messages I really want to leave you with. I don't know how my time is doing. Can someone give me a prompt on time?
Yes, Eric, it's Peter here. Yeah, we have another 3 or 4 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, I'll just finish up. I've talked very quickly about the gas thing. I want to plug High Deploy, a wonderful British government-backed project, and all the amazing people working to put 20% hydrogen straight into our British gas network nationally. So here's a very quick example again: energy efficiency, refurb. Let's put insulation and double glazing, and oh my God, stop right there. The 20,000 workers and the 20,000 vans and the 20,000 skips every day to gut all the rubbish out of the houses, take it away in landfill, the huge factories to create the insulation and the double glazing and fit the new boilers and the massive cost and the time, blah, blah, blah. Put all of that in a box and say, okay, you're going to save these people 25% on their drugs bill every year. What do I mean by drugs bill? The black stuff we're all hooked on. You're not doing a thing to eliminate fossil fuels from the economy, spending a huge amount of time, effort, money, resource, and producing massive pollution and carbon. Do you know what you can do? Take advantage of this amazing High Deploy system. For a third of the money, you get far greater carbon offset. Just onshore wind, offshore wind, which we have in abundance, very cheap electricity. We've got amazing electrolyzer production facility in this country. Produce green hydrogen, pump it straight into the nearest gas pipe. Voila, you've just dropped the entire carbon footprint of the country by 20%, literally. Home heating and industrial heating, you put 20% hydrogen in, fraction of the cost, far more efficient, far faster, and we're already spending all the money that we need to spend on the gas mains replacement. Doesn't require any more money, just produce the green hydrogen and pump it in. But there's a lot more to that story, but time is of the essence here. Just let me give you an example. If concrete was a country, it would have the 3rd biggest carbon footprint on the planet, right? Only India and America produce more carbon than concrete. Roughly 900 kilos of carbon dioxide per ton. Steel's double that, it's 1,800 kilos. Now, just think, we've got blast furnaces produce. It's a long story in that there is a chemical reaction that's unavoidable, but long story short, we can halve that carbon production literally overnight by replacing the blast furnaces, be they electrical or fossil fuel, with hydrogen. Now, Mitsubishi, there are huge engineering firms that now have gas turbines ready to run on pure hydrogen. That is an obvious way we can really radically reduce global carbon by just implementing technology we have today. Build the infrastructure, job creation. We're going to run out of workers in Britain. There won't be an unemployment crisis, there'll be an employment crisis. We will need to start importing workers. We could reopen the heavy engineering, the Victorian factories, everything from car making and steel making. We could re-employ all these people to commoditize hydrogen fuel cells, hydrogen electrolyzers, on and offshore wind, and produce green hydrogen. We need to be looking at 50 to 80 gigawatts of production. Last point, Goldman Sachs. Here's me talking all these wonderful environmental solutions. I'm here to say I love Goldman Sachs Carbonomics. They produced this report. Have a Google for Goldman Sachs Carbonomics, a report. Here's a couple of quotes from it. And when a hardcore investment bank that has funded multiple fossil fuel investments in the past says this, you're onto something. In aggregate, we, Goldman Sachs, see a total investment opportunity of 16 trillion, not million, not billion, 16 trillion by 2030. You mean in 10 years, this is a $16 trillion sector. This scenario would be consistent with the global ambition to contain global warming within 2 degrees C. Now, I'm here to say the hell on earth that we've unleashed at 1 degree C, and kind of like the logarithmic increase, when you double the wind speed, it's a rule of 8 power, the energy goes up by a factor of 8. If you think 1 degree is bad, 2 degrees isn't twice as bad, it's an order of magnitude worse. So the 16 trillion is actually very conservative, because they're spending at a rate consistent with containing global warming to a seriously bad point. We need obviously to contain it to 1.5 degrees, and then implement what I said at the start, direct air capture. We need to use this unlimited. Every 6 hours, enough solar energy hits the deserts of the world to power the planet for a year. We need to grab some of that and power DAC. Don't let anyone tell you desalination or direct air capture is expensive. Rubbish. It is only energy hungry. But wait a minute, every 6 hours, enough solar energy hits the desert. I'll never stop saying that, guys. We need to capture and use this unmeasurably cheap energy source to remove carbon from the atmosphere that we've produced by burning fossil fuels, and desalinate fresh water on an unprecedented scale, because we've got the energy, and we're looking at deserts, coastal deserts with low biodiversity. We can produce zero carbon hydrogen, zero carbon fresh water through desalination, and then you green the desert. Think of the implications of solving the energy, water, and food crisis. You just need to think big enough. You need to think construction the size of a medium city, a Cambridge-sized construction. We need 1,000 of them. Would that be a fair trade? Let's build 1,000 cities around the planet within 10 years to solve the energy, the water, and the food crisis. I challenge anyone to debate with me that that's not entirely feasible starting in January 2021. This should be a UN emergency meeting. We need to implement the ecocide laws. Please Google ecocide. Implement ecocide laws, and that will automatically drive up the carbon price. A carbon tax. Goldman Sachs are advocating for a huge increase in carbon tax. Bet you never saw that one coming. They're saying, back to Goldman Sachs, 15 to 20 million new jobs by 2030. Green infrastructure is 1.5 to 3 times more capital and job intensive than fossil fuels. So we would double to triple the required workforce. We won't be laying off ESO workers. We'll be reallocating them to save the planet. We'll be using the high pressure gas expertise of Aberdeen in this country. In Aberdeen, our oil industry skilled workforce, wow, we're going to have to triple that workforce to get in this action. The Scottish government's moving fast. Hopefully the British government will be moving equally fast. And just yesterday, I saw the German Franco Alliance with 10 billion euros invested over the next 10 years in green hydrogen related projects. So we're getting there, guys. Just finished the last couple of sentences on Goldman Sachs. renewable power will become the largest area of spending in the energy industry in 2021 for the first time in history, reaching 25% of total energy supply. CapEx by bifurcating, it gets into some technical finance terms, cost of capital, up to 20% for oil, down to 3 to 5% for renewables. By tilting the financial investment returns, because nothing happens in this planet till it's funded. There has never been a good energy project or a bad mine built without funding. And you manipulate the financial markets to tip in the favor of what we need to do, and that in itself is more important than many other high-profile media campaigns. You make it profitable for the money to back the solutions, and that will happen. So I think that's my last slide. Happy to take any questions, or have I overrun my time?
Thank you very much, Derek. So at this stage, we haven't had any questions coming in from the floor. So before we wrap up, I'd just like to say if there's one final message you would like to leave, Derek.
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to leave positive message in people's mind. I hope I have outlined the scale of the problem and put it in a definable bubble. That image of 3 nuclear bombs worth of heat energy every second going into our oceans. But guys, the solutions are bigger, better, and available now. We can focus on the solutions and implementing them in months, literally 90 days. There is nothing beyond our grasp. And if we collectively, as countries, we talk about leaving the EU. If we were invaded by aliens tomorrow, I don't think there'd be any borders. We would all just coalesce and fight the enemy. Well, again, as Prince Charles said, the enemy is global warming and biodiversity loss. That's the twin enemies. And I would always stress to people, we could solve the climate crisis tomorrow, and we would still vanish as a species unless we solve the biodiversity crisis. And the beauty of the green hydrogen economy is it does both at the same time. Don't have time to go into that right now, but both problems, there's two sides of the same problem, same coin, just like hydrogen and ammonia are 2 sides of the same coin in the solution. So that's it. Huge problems. We've got huge solutions. We need to act super fast and work together. That's the message.
Okay, thank you very much, Derek. We'll wrap that up now.
Brilliant.
So I'd like to